Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your patience this morning as we all got in. I am Sarah Mojla. I am a member of the board, and I would like to, before we get started, invite the interpreters to talk about language access, and then we will begin.
Hi, everybody. My name is Joanne, and my pronouns are she, her. And I am joined today by my comrade and co-interpreter, Sabina, whose pronouns are she, they. We are members of Bancha Lenguas Language Justice Collective based in Bulbancha, Louisiana, also known as New Orleans. Hola a todos, mi nombre es Joanne y mis pronombres son ella. Y hoy estoy con mi compa y cointérprete Sabina, sus pronombres son ella, ella. Somos miembros del colectivo de justicia del lenguaje Bancha Lenguas basado en Bulbancha, Louisiana, también conocido como New Orleans. Bulbancha es la palabra Choctaw que significa la tierra donde se hablan muchos lenguajes. Bulbancha is the Choctaw word which means the land where many languages are spoken. Como trabajadores de justicia del lenguaje, nos esforzamos a crear un espacio para que todos aquí presentes puedan entender y ser entendidos en el idioma en que nos sentimos más poderosos. As language justice workers, we strive to create space for everybody here to be understood and understand in the language in which we feel most powerful. En Bancha Lenguas trabajamos hacia la inclusividad de género en nuestro trabajo por la justicia del lenguaje. At Bancha Lenguas, we work towards gender inclusivity in our language justice work. Notará que estamos usando la palabra E al final de palabras binarias. Esto no es un error, es nuestro intento en crear lenguaje más inclusivo e incluir personas de todos los géneros. You will notice we are using the letter E at the end of gendered words. It's not an error, it is us attempting to create more inclusive language and include people of all genders. Hoy proveeremos interpretación simultánea del español al inglés y del inglés al español como parte de nuestro esfuerzo por crear espacios multilingües. Today, we'll be providing simultaneous interpretation from English to Spanish and Spanish to English as part of our effort to create multilingual spaces. Now, we'll explain how to access the interpretation platform. Ahora explicaremos cómo acceder a la plataforma de interpretación. If you're using a computer, you will see a globe icon at the bottom of your screen with the word interpretation. Click on it and select the channel with your language of choice. For smartphone or tablet, look for 3 dots that read more. Click on that and make your selection. Si está usando una computadora, vas a ver un icono de globo al pie de tu pantalla con la palabra interpretación. Haz clic sobre él y selecciona el canal de tu lenguaje preferido, inglés o español. Para teléfono inteligente o tableta, busca 3 puntos que leen más. Haz clic para hacer tu selección. To create this space together, a few things. Please speak at a slow and steady pace. If you're talking too fast, you'll see us do a hand signal to slow down or we'll pop into the chat. Please speak loudly and clearly. We will do this hand signal if you're speaking too softly, or we'll also add it to the chat. Please try to say the full name of organizations and other acronyms. Keep an eye on the chat in case we send a message to slow down or speak up. Keep your mic on mute when you're not speaking, and if you have headphones, please use them. One speaker at a time, interpreters can only interpret one voice at a time. We don't want to be in the position of having to decide which voice to privilege over another voice. Para crear este espacio juntos, algunas cositas. Por favor, hable a un paso lento y constante. Si está hablando muy rápido, nos verá escribirlo en el chat. Hable en voz alta y clara. También le diremos en el chat si necesitamos escucharte. Intente decir el nombre completo de los acrónimos, por ejemplo, de diferentes organizaciones. Échele un ojo al chat por si enviamos un mensaje para hablar más lentamente o hablar en voz más alta. Mantén su micrófono en silencio si no está hablando y si tiene audífonos con micrófonos, utilízalos. Una persona a la vez. Los intérpretes solamente pueden interpretar una voz a la vez. No queremos estar en la posición de tener que decidir cuál voz privilegiar sobre otra. Lastly, don't suffer in silence. If you have any problem with hearing us or the speakers, please send a message in the chat. Por último, no sufra en silencio. Si tiene cualquier problema escuchándonos a nosotros o los presentadores, por favor envía un mensaje al chat. Thank you for your commitment to creating a multilingual space. Gracias por su compromiso en crear un espacio multilingüe.
All right, thank you so much. Again, I am Sarah Mojola. I'm the Associate Director of Vera Institute of Justice's New Orleans office, where we advocate for criminal justice reform using data and policy. I'm also a proud board member and president of Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, which I'll get into more later. That also means I have a very small role there, and staff and executive director do all of the work. Welcome to the 15th annual Fit for a King Summit, which is LaFHAC's annual tribute to the work and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is the second year we're hosting the summit virtually, and we really, really hope we don't need a third because this morning Zoom was acting up. Before we begin, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge that anytime we're talking about housing, we're also talking about land. And while we might be virtual this year, this land that we occupy is Indigenous land. And I'm speaking to you from what we now call New Orleans, but was once known as Bobancha, a place of many tongues and home to tribes such as the Chitimacha, the Atacuba, the Homa, the Ishak, and Choctaw tribes, among many others whose names and languages we no longer know. Further, we must acknowledge that Black people were stolen from their homeland, enslaved, and forced to work this stolen land for the benefit of colonizers and enslavers. As we talk today about displacement, discrimination, and resistance in Louisiana, we hope to honor this Indigenous history and the ongoing connected struggle against colonization of this land and the struggle for liberation. The past year has been exhausting and challenging in a lot of ways. We've seen incredible organizing efforts to keep each other safe from COVID, to end police brutality, to fight for housing justice, and meet each other's basic needs after a deadly storm. We've also endured heartbreaking backlashes that always land hardest on communities of color. Our theme this year is Meeting the Moment, which recognizes that we must find new and creative ways to move forward in our fight while remaining rooted in and connected to community. Our work must also be rooted in understanding of the ways in which communities are fighting back against injustice and winning. We're inspired to highlight some of the work that many of those wins throughout our summit this year. Unlike last year, when we broke up the summit over 3 days, this year you're going to hear from experts on 3 panels. We'll present 2 awards, and we'll close with a keynote speaker all before lunch. Our keynote speaker is Sheryll Cashin. You can see the full agenda for today at fitforaking.org, and that link will be shared in the chat. And so let's pause a little bit for some housekeeping items. Please make sure to fill out the evaluations today. We carefully review feedback and use it to improve the event every single year. We will share a link to the evaluation at the end of the day. If you have to log out before the end of the program, you'll see the evaluation pop up immediately before you log out. If you have any questions for speakers, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have technical questions about Zoom or LaFHAC's work throughout the day, you can reach us by email at info@lafairhousing.org or chat in the chat LaFHAC staff. Now, I'd like to share some information about Fair Housing Action Center. Our mission is to eradicate housing discrimination throughout the state of Louisiana. We know that housing discrimination leads to segregation and that neighborhoods and communities are not treated fairly. Housing discrimination has to end in this nation if we're ever going to achieve racial and economic justice. We work to end housing discrimination in several ways. LaFHAC's education and outreach team provides fair housing trainings to make sure people throughout our community know their rights and responsibilities. LaFHAC's policy staff work at the local, state, and national levels to push for policies that make housing more fair and accessible to everyone. Our enforcement staff investigate complaints about fair housing violations to find out when and where housing discrimination is occurring. Staff also assist victims with filing administrative complaints and lawsuits to hold discriminators accountable. Our home ownership protection program provides counseling services for homeowners facing foreclosure. Lastly, LaFHAC added an eviction defense program during the pandemic to provide legal representation for residents facing eviction, including undocumented community members who may not qualify for other services. See, I told y'all, they do a lot. They do the most. It's great. We are a statewide agency that works in tandem with partner organizations and community members and couldn't do this work without you, so thank you. We would love for you to get more involved in our work through working with us to offer fair housing training to your staff, members, clients, or students, making referrals, providing input on policies that impact your community, alerting us if you see housing discrimination in any form, completing our action alerts, or becoming a mystery shopper or tester. You can read more about our work at lafairhousing.org, and there will be a link in the chat. Finally, this year has shown us how important it is to be agile and able to shift our work as needed, depending on the immediate needs in our community. Your support makes that possible. We're asking people in our network to consider signing up as a recurring donor in any amount today. Also, you know people, get them to sign up as well. The links are in your chat, and I would like to turn it over now and introduce Kashana Hill, LaFHAC's brilliant, steadfast, awesome executive director, and really I can't say enough good things about her, and she will be moderating the first panel, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah, for that welcome and for that introduction. And always thank you for your service on LaFHAC's board. We appreciate you. Okay, so welcome again, everyone, and good morning. Thank you so much for sticking with us through these technical difficulties. We certainly did some practice runs and had no problems. And then today, you know, we've all been kept on our toes, but I certainly had my coffee this morning, and I think we've got things, if not fully resolved, mostly resolved. And so we're so thankful for your patience. We appreciate you all. And we're looking forward to a very exciting conversation today. So as Sarah mentioned, my name is Kashana Hill, and I serve as LaFHAC's executive director. As we start today and jump right into our first panel, I want to remind you all that you can use the Q&A function to ask questions throughout the conversation today. Please post questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat. And then please also feel free to post your questions throughout the panel rather than saving them until the end, and we'll address them as we have time. Also want to remind everyone that you can see the full agenda, including all of the speaker bios, at fitforaking.org/agenda, and we'll go ahead and post that link in the chat. Again, it's fitforaking.org/agenda. And I want to refer you all there to check out the bios of our amazing speakers because we will not have time to get into detailed descriptions of everyone's backgrounds today. So please do feel free to read about our panelists at fitforaking.org/agenda. So we are now going to move into the first conversation today, which is titled 606 Missing Homes, How Not in My Backyard Opposition to Affordable Housing Perpetuates Segregation. And I will ask all of our panelists to please go ahead and turn your cameras on, and we will get started. All right, and as we have everyone joining us, We will go ahead and get started this morning. We have John Adcock with us. We have Sheryll Cashin, Sue Mobley, and Nellie Katzen to have a conversation about how not in my backyard sentiment, which we will abbreviate today as NIMBY, N-I-M-B-Y, how NIMBY opposition perpetuates segregation in our community and in communities across the country. And we'll start first with a question that we'll pose to Sue Mobley. So Sue, zoning and land use policy have long played a role in encouraging and enforcing segregation across the country, including in New Orleans. And we heard in the welcome from Sarah how this history is really rooted in the displacement of Indigenous peoples from their land, right? And so as we see this pattern continue, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit of historical context to help us understand how we have come to have such segregated housing patterns in New Orleans today.
My favorite question. First of all, thank you for having me and for the invitation to share historical context, which is basically my favorite thing to do. So cities have been planned for millennia. We can look at workers' towns and architect villages around the pyramids and see evidence of urban planning and zoning long before there was a field of planning or any zoning laws. Putting the cemeteries on the outskirts of town rather than having bodies in the center was a land use decision that New Orleans was making in the 1700s, as was the grid of streets laid out in the same pattern as other colonial cities across the Atlantic region. But the field of planning and the laws around zoning and land use, they really get their legs under them in the beginning of the 20th century. With the first major zoning ordinances passing in LA in 1904 and New York in 1916. And they come into existence in the American context with some very explicit goals around race and class. Between 1910 and 1918, cities all over the South passed explicitly race-based residential segregation ordinances. That's Richmond, Baltimore, Louisville, Oklahoma City, New Orleans, and St. Louis, just to name a few. And St. Louis is where that practice got a check. St. Louis's racial zoning ordinance was challenged in 1917 with Buchanan v. Warley, made it all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The court threw out the law on the basis that it violated the 14th Amendment. As you probably can imagine, that was quite a topic of discussion at the 10th National Conference of City Planning in 1918 in St. Louis. You can read the proceedings online. You should. It was a barn burner of a meeting. It's also the meeting where many of the terms, practices, and frameworks that we still see used first come into play. So explicitly, blight is used as indicated by race, class, and nationality of residents, rather than the condition of buildings. And William Stanton from Philadelphia proposed as a cure for blight that cities make strenuous objection to proposals for building flimsy structures for the housing of workmen, as these structures would degenerate into mere shacks, especially in view of the fact that as a rule, they would not be occupied by the most careful class of residents. See, the first strategic application of planning and zoning to support detached dwellings, size requirements that would develop into a widespread national model of single-family zoning. Frederick Law Olmsted suggested zoning and building at different scales for different occupants, those having certain desires and certain limitations which are more or less coincident with their nationality. We also see the first suggestions of the use of eminent domain and public-private partnerships for what would become slum clearance and later urban renewal. Nelson Cunliffe proposed adoption of the German system for containing industrial zones and the residents who work in them, in which cities take large sections of land, raise the buildings, replot the area, and develop the district through cooperation of the municipality with private owners. And they may even have helped create the NIMBY. And they certainly strategized to target the land use decision makers of that era. Lawson Purdy, a property tax reformer, suggested popularizing the idea of preserving the value of a man's house. Get that talked about. When you meet one of these judges, tell him about it, so that when, by and by, a case comes before him as a judge, it will already be entirely familiar to him. So the fathers of the field of American urban planning worked together to strategize and develop tactics for a slightly more subtle form of racial discrimination and class exclusion than that which the court had struck down. The roots of the field are actively, explicitly segregationist, but they got a lot of help over the years from adjacent fields: law, banking, public health, and education.
Thanks, Sue. Is that as far as we're going? I just want to make sure.
We're hanging out in 1918 this morning.
Okay, all right.
Salvo.
Okay, I just, because there's so much, and I just wanted to make sure that you were able to get to where you were going without us moving on. So thank you for that. So we're going to move over to Nellie and to Sheryll. And I want to ask you specifically about your experiences of NIMBY opposition to affordable housing. So as you both know, LaFHAC's recent report titled "Delayed Until Downsized or Denied" tells of how more than 600 affordable homes, right? More than 600 units of affordable housing were prevented from being built in the city of New Orleans in the last 15 years because of this "not in my backyard" sentiment. So Nellie, if we can start with you, I'd like to hear about what your experience with NIMBY opposition to affordable housing has been.
Thanks so much. Through my role as director of the Committee for a Better New Orleans, and previously while I was working on the LaFHAC Greenway and really galvanizing communities around that space, I've been in a lot of neighborhood association meetings. One neighborhood association meeting that I went to was in one of the neighborhoods adjacent to the Greenway. It was directly across the Greenway from the LaFHAC, which is a permanently affordable housing development. And I sat in on their first meeting. Present were 10 or so residents, none of whom had been in the neighborhood for more than 2 years, and none of whom looked like the people who I saw every day in the neighborhood around there. Most importantly, nobody was Black. A lot of white people all saying, we're going to start this new neighborhood association. And they invited their councilperson to this meeting where they were going to vote on their bylaws and their officers. I looked around and thought, I don't know if this is going to work. Certainly, who are these folks to sort of kind of name this neighborhood, claim it without anybody else in the room? And when the council person for District B, you may know her, LaToya Cantrell, was asked to give feedback on what's going on in the district and so on and so forth, she said, now I know you're not about to make a vote and make your decisions about how this organization is going to be run when nobody in here looks like the neighborhood, when you don't have the representation that you need. And she was right, of course. The folks in the room didn't have the representation that they need. They did go ahead and elect their officers and set their bylaws with that lack of representation. And the reason that I mention this is because not only when an affordable housing project comes up in a neighborhood, but really at the foundation of the block of community we're using as a proxy for quote unquote community voice, it starts from that foundation. And then when an affordable housing project does come up and you have already not necessarily all the right voices at the table, you have folks whose structures, their entire organizations were built to designed to uphold and to serve a certain group of people, it allows some of this language to come in. Here's some of the things that I hear used. A lot of them were summarized very well in the report, which if you haven't read it and you're participating, please do read it. It is so valuable and important. Here's some of the things that people are concerned about. I'm afraid that the crime is going to go up because of this development. It's a lot of anti-density and anti-renter language, worries about trash and noise and parking. We just saw this happen uptown, a big to-do about parking. And then things that seem a little bit less insidious, like design and neighborhood character, which is my personal favorite because nobody really knows what it means. And if we are upholding the neighborhood character that one group wants without a discussion about what the character of the neighborhood truly is, that sort of vague language allows anti-renter sentiment, anti-density sentiment to kill some of these projects. I know that Sheryll has some really salient points here, so I don't want to take too much time.
Well, thank you, Nellie. I also just want to add, as we move on to Sheryll, that Nellie, you've raised what is a critically important part of LaFHAC's delayed until downsized report, which is that majority white neighborhood associations, right, which are very unrepresentative of the racial demographics of the city of New Orleans, are really granted so much power in our zoning and land use decisions. And they have the ability, these groups that are unrepresentative have the ability, because of choices made by local elected officials, to stop these kinds of developments. And so Sheryll, given our understanding of these dynamics, right, would love to have you speak to your experiences working in the advocacy space where you've encountered NIMBY opposition to affordable housing.
Sure. So again, thank you for having me here, hailing from Houston. And so the example that I'm going to share is kind of the opposite of what Nellie was just talking about. There was a development in Houston, and I'm not sure to what extent folks are familiar with Houston, but this is specifically the Galleria area. So a very, well-established, this is an area very well established and also very high income. This is where there are several shops and malls, and this is a robust business center that people kind of flock to when they come to Houston. And so after following Hurricane Ike in 2008, there was an agreement with the city and with HUD that the housing authority would actually take steps to actually develop a site specifically in a high opportunity area. And so this particular project was actually on was proposed rather to be on the Houston Housing Authority's property that they owned. And this was a mixed income, multi-family development. And this was to be like right over 230 apartments. 70% of them will be available to families who earn 60% AMI, 20% were market rate, and 10%, which was just 23 apartments, were set aside for extremely low income families or for public housing residents. And that was the hook that the community groups really sunk their teeth in. This public housing, how dare you bring this public housing into our community? So of course there was a public comment, and I've attended several public comment periods before, so I just thought I was going to go and just give my support for the project. And just to show, just to give you how distinctly I remember this, it was a rainy Wednesday. And I remember distinctly thinking, okay, it's rainy, it's Wednesday, no one's going to be there. And when I walked into the elementary school cafeteria, there were over 200 people that were there ready to give their comment. And so I, was immediately just struck by that. And I automatically felt like a shift in me, like, oh, wow, this is not what's typical. And as the housing authority is making their presentation, I'm hearing people just loudly say things like, oh, it pays to be a loser. What about the citizenship? Will they check that? Oh, this sounds like the same plan they had for busing years ago. I mean, just blatant. They're going to bring our property value down. And while, everyone's entitled to their own position, I was extremely uncomfortable because this was NIMBY in its purest form. Like, you hear about the things, but to actually witness it in that space. And so I went on, and although I was very hesitant, I was nervous, I went ahead and gave my public comment, and just basically kind of called the folks out on what they were saying and the things that I was hearing. and really telling them that they have deemed these people undesirable without even knowing them, and just using these racial veils, and reminding them that these people are the same folks that are greeting you at Starbucks and Whole Foods Market as you go about your daily routine. These are the folks that are handling your banking needs. These are the folks that are serving your colleagues as you're closing business deals. However, you have not determined or been okay with them actually living in your zip code. They can help you sustain your quality of life, but they can't be your neighbor. And so I challenge everyone to examine their reasoning for their opposition and to face their fears and to stop succumbing to rhetoric. So as you may imagine, my remarks were not met with open arms. There were boos and other outbursts. And I actually, after talking to media was there, I had to actually be escorted to my car because there were actual crowds that were yelling things at me because I stated the obvious. So one of the other things I just want to kind of raise, or just, so that was the actual experience, right? But then you have the inside game of what's going on. The facts are, this was a proposed development because in response to Hurricane Ike. So this was a project where there were no city funds that were going to this project. The opposition was white-led, with city council members, a school board member, and a state representative. The property was owned by the Houston Housing Authority. And in order for the Housing Authority to move forward, all they needed was city council support or either no objection. And in response, our mayor would not even put it on city council agenda, citing that the units were too expensive. Now, remind you, this didn't even come out of the city budget at all. This had nothing to do with the city, yet that was his reasoning for not putting it on city council agenda. Another thing I kind of want to raise is that oftentimes, Houston is looked at as the place that has no zoning, but zoning does not, or the lack of zoning does not really lay out a plan or a pathway for more affordable housing and to curb NIMBYism. If anything, it's being more so the Wild Wild West and letting people kind of craft their agendas in a more open format.
Thank you, Sheryll. And I think your last point is important. We hear, and we're starting to hear more, people who work in this space, we're hearing more and more often, well, the quote unquote solution is to just get rid of zoning, right? If there's no zoning anywhere, then we won't have issues of NIMBYism, killing affordable housing developments. And so appreciate hearing your perspective that in Houston, where there famously is no zoning, we still see white-led neighborhood groups given the power and authority to kill affordable housing developments. So John, we're going to move over to you for the legal perspective, right? If we know that the end of zoning does not equal the end of NIMBYism, what about the law as a way to fight back against these behaviors? And so I want to ask you, because we know that NIMBY opposition to affordable housing is often based on racist stereotypes. As we've heard and as we've experienced in New Orleans, the opposition is often based on language around quote unquote crime. We've heard at LaFHAC opposition based on proposed developments that will, according to white-led neighborhood associations, bring quote unquote drugs, right? Quote unquote prostitution. There are all these race-based stereotypes when it comes to the development of affordable housing that we continue to hear. And so I'd like to know from you, what have courts said about race-based NIMBYism? Is this an issue, and we know it is, that has been addressed by courts, and what has typically been the outcome?
Yes, thank you, Kashana. I'm so glad to be here this morning with you all. The courts have dealt with this on a number of occasions. There's a wonderful law called the Fair Housing Act that was passed in 1968 that allows courts to address these situations and right wrongs. And unlike a lot of laws in our country, the courts actually deal well with these situations and generally do the right thing, principally because I think the Fair Housing Act is such a strong, robust civil rights law. We normally think about the Fair Housing Act in terms of it applying when there's racial discrimination in renting a house or purchasing a house, but it also applies, and what we're talking about here is when a city, municipality, prevents the building of affordable housing in a way that harms or limits the housing opportunities of African Americans. I'll just be brief here and just relate this by illustrating this through two cases. The one is the St. Bernard case, our neighbor downriver, where the court said that the St. Bernard Parish was violating the Fair Housing Act when they placed a moratorium on building multifamily housing. And they looked at several things to determine that this is actually racial discrimination, illegal racial discrimination. It noted that African-American households are 85% more likely to live in multifamily housing than white households. 52% of African-American households in the New Orleans metropolitan area live in rental units compared to just 25% of Caucasian households. And then African-American households are much more likely to have incomes within the income ranges for the proposed affordable housing there. The court also looked at, and other courts in looking at these cases also look at kind of a city's history in dealing with racial discrimination, whether that be how they situate their schools or their housing policy, whether they previously excluded African Americans from certain parts of the city, whether when they have public hearings, like we've been talking about, they get community input. And often what's significant to these courts is whether the community is using kind of this race-coded language, like this going to bring blight into our neighborhood, or it's going to bring crime here, or it's going to create a ghetto. Those are usually race-coded languages, language where people actually mean we don't want Black people living next to us. And so it's courts look at who is actually going to be affected, and then also the atmosphere and the circumstances around the decision that the municipality makes to determine whether this violates the Fair Housing Act. Another case is a famous case from Long Island called the Huntington case from 1988. Also a good case. There, a white suburb restricted multifamily housing to a largely minority area. And also the town board refused to amend that ordinance to allow construction of subsidized housing. The town's ordinance as it existed prohibited construction of multifamily housing, except in only two very small areas of the town where Black folks live. 95% of its residents were white, and African Americans were only 3% of the population. And the town historically had a shortage of affordable rental housing for low and moderate income households. And therefore the impact of this restriction fell 3 times greater on Black folks than it did on the overall population. So there the court ordered the town to get rid of its ordinance restricting where you can build affordable housing there, because it found that their restriction in this case constituted racial discrimination. So those are just 2 illustrations about where courts come in and how they kind of analyze these things very, very briefly. And like I say, generally courts are doing the right thing in these cases generally when you can supply the evidence, because I think the Fair Housing Act is such a robust, wonderful civil rights law. That's what I have to say in brief.
Thank you so much, John. And I know this is a topic that could go on forever. I do want to ask you about one more area. We certainly are talking about race-based NIMBYism today, right? But there are other ways in which this not in my backyard sentiment keeps people out of certain communities. And so if you could talk just a little bit about how NIMBYism is a disability justice issue as well, I'd appreciate hearing that. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to say 2 things about that. So where you normally see this is when people want to locate sober homes in single family housing areas of a city. And sober homes are where people who are recovering from drug and alcohol addiction go to get sober. There's support networks there. There's classes they go to. There's help finding them a job, et cetera, et cetera. These people are usually housing insecure, so it helps in that area too. And the Fair Housing Act says that if you're recovering from drug and alcohol addiction and not presently using, of course, you're considered to have a disability. And when these sober homes start in neighborhoods, oftentimes what happens, I've seen in my experience in doing these cases, homeowners associations oppose them and they think criminals are living next to them. There's going to be crime in their neighborhood. And so they try to stop it and get it closed. And usually what happens is it's usually unrelated people living under the same roof. And so they're usually in violation of the zoning ordinances. So what you can do is you use the Fair Housing Act to request a reasonable accommodation in zoning to ask for basically an exception in zoning to allow this sober home to stay open because the people that in there need it in order to stay sober. That's usually how this comes up. And the second thing I want to say is these cases are also usually about race. And if not, they're usually about the other. People know what I'm talking about. It's just a matter of not being able to prove that part of it. And so the evidence is not that robust. The opposition to this sober home is race-based or so thankfully the residents of this house are covered by the Fair Housing Act and they can take advantage of its mandates to request a reasonable accommodation. So the federal reporters are filled with cases like this, and thankfully they usually come out the right way. So it's definitely NIMBYism is directed at people with disabilities in that respect, without a doubt.
Thank you, John. And we're going to move into some additional questions for all the panelists. And I just want to remind us that we have interpreters who are working very hard to make sure that they can bring all of this information to everyone with us today. So if we can just please remember to speak slowly so the interpreters can catch everything, that would be much appreciated. So I'd like to ask everyone, and again, for our attendees, if you do have questions, please go ahead and post them into the chat or into the Q&A box. I'm sorry, please post your questions in the Q&A box. But I'd like to ask everyone, what strategies are fair housing advocates across the country using to counter NIMBYism? And how can we see the Fair Housing Act being used successfully as one tool to counter NIMBYism? Sue, I don't know if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share here. Nellie, you know, given your experience with neighborhood groups, and Sue, given your breadth of experience, we'd love to hear from you. And then John and Sheryll, if you have anything additional to add, please feel free.
I'm going to answer with a soft definition of advocates, because I think that some of what I've seen that's been most effective, and this is from the perspective from, I'm putting on my former city planning commissioner hat. Some of what I've seen that has been most effective has been members of the public who do understand where that coded language is, who can who are informed by work like LaFHAC now's report, armed with tools to intervene in public comments, to call out coded language as racist, to call out coded language as discriminatory against families, against folks with disabilities, and to do that in a frame that helps the folks who are often making land use decisions, if not more aware of it, at least less able to pretend it's not happening. Because here's the thing, is that like planning commissioners aren't necessarily particularly knowledgeable about the law, land use, planning. It's a political post in this city and in a lot of cities. So the qualifications can range a lot. And when people hear from a steady stream of their neighbors, they listen to their neighbors. The people who can serve on them are people who are have the luxury of usually serving in a free job It's, 30 hours a month, unpaid. You got to have some flexibility around your mainstream gig. So being able to hear advocacy within the public comments helps a lot. Kicking it to Nellie.
Thank you. And Nellie, we'd love to hear from you. I know you've got some ideas, right, around what can be done to create a community engagement infrastructure that explicitly prioritizes equity and fair housing, which feels very important because, again, we know from the LaFHAC report and from the conversation that we're having today that these white-led neighborhood associations are really exercising outsized influence on local land use decisions, right? And so what can we all do to ensure that the engagement infrastructure looks more equitable?
Thanks. CBNO, the Committee for a Better New Orleans, has been working on this issue since 2003. Actually, we started looking at it at the behest of the City Planning Commission, who asked us, recognizing there's some equity challenges, asked us to reimagine the way that we seek community input. Now, this was before the neighborhood participation process, right now, the tool where a lot of this sentiment comes in. And actually the NPP, the neighborhood participation process, was a piece of this much bigger structure that it relied upon to work. I recently watched a history podcast about the first use of the tank in warfare. And this tank went ahead of all of these infantrymen on foot. And the only communication they had to communicate what they got, the information they got a much faster than they've ever gotten it before, was a carrier pigeon. And the whole mission failed because the communication wasn't working, right? Mm-hmm. It needed an entire structure and system to make it work that wasn't there. And I think that the NP, we're learning that the neighborhood participation process is a little like that first mission. Mm-hmm. At the time, there was a thinking that more input will lead to more equity. And it turns out that it depends who's giving that input and what they're saying. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really glad that Sue shared the way that we have over time and over history designed this system, because it's really important to hold in mind that since we designed this, we can undesign it. We can design something else, right? We can design a system for the people who we want most to engage. And those should be the people who are closest to the problem. Part of the challenge with using geographically based and oftentimes homeownership based groups of people as a proxy for community is it's going to recycle the same structures of power and privilege that got those folks into that place in the first place, right? It's even if we eliminate the policy that's driving segregation, segregation will drive itself. So we need to design the system instead of for these already more powerful voices, we need to design the system to share power. That means deliberately inclusive, right? Including the people closest to the problem. It means eliminating the sentiment of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, right? We tried to invite our neighbors who aren't white homeowners and they didn't want to come. Well, we need to examine that. Why didn't they want to come? Is it because they don't think it's going to work for them to engage because it never has worked for them before? Is it because I have a friend who I love, she's a Black woman in Treme, who said, Nellie, I love you, but you come in this neighborhood and you're always going to be a white lady with a clipboard to some extent. Stop sending in the white lady with the clipboard and bring community together. Another thing that needs to be is proactive, engaging people before decisions are made. This is really critical because it leads folks to being able to actually feel like their input is going to be used and not think that the whole concept is futile. Two-way dialogue is critical here too. Public notice is not the same as public engagement. A public comment is meaningful and we want more people to give them. And it's a one-way thing that could just as well be going into the ether unless we know how that public comment is going to be used and we can track it. The two-way dialogue also allows for people to build relationships with one another within communities across difference. It also allows for folks to weigh trade-offs, right? If you are a person who doesn't need affordable housing, that is, you already have it, then you might be willing to say, you know, I care more about the design than whether this thing is built and built with urgency, right? You might, even with the best of intentions, be able to leverage your power and privilege through expressing a priority for something about the development itself to be different. An opportunity that is two-way and deliberative gives people a chance to say, oh, you know, I didn't think about that. I'm actually willing to live with a design that I don't love because it means that dozens or hundreds of affordable units can be built in my neighborhood and my neighbors can now live there. There needs to be transparency. Expectations of all parties need to be clearly defined. People need to be able to see how their input is used and how it has been used. Other cities that have this community participation structure and framework that CBNO has worked on for such time, including Birmingham is one example. A city leader there said, listen, we don't always do what the community wants, but we don't do anything without knowing what the community wants. And that's because they have this proactive and deliberative process where priorities can be set, trade-offs can be examined, and people have a framework to start from, a foundation to start from as they move forward. I will add, we put together a structure for changing, completely reimagining the way that the city does community engagement. And we completed that in 2013. Now, the world looks a lot different now than it did from the years of 2003 to 2013. We have 15 more years of mistrust, distrust, and trauma on the community's plates. We have more distraction. We have social media, which has completely changed public life. And so we're going to need to be creative in how we design the process for who we want to attend. That means the meeting structure, location, time, whether food and childcare is provided, whether it's a meeting or something more interesting than a meeting. That means people need the context and education that they need to navigate the process, and you need to set an even playing field for that. And you can use data to drive outreach and decisions to keep people's feelings having more input than fact, right? Use data to determine where the greatest need is, who needs to be involved in the process, et cetera. Importantly, our model relies on the city prioritizing it. It needs city funding and people's time for it to work. And the reason for that is the process already has money, right? Neighborhood associations with dues are already introducing money into the process.
Nellie, I'm so sorry. Could I just, could I jump in here? For time's sake, I wanted to see if any of our other panelists had any additional comments. I mean, I think what we're hearing from Nellie, the overall theme is so important, right? We can really put new systems in place that ensure that we are hearing the voices of people who are impacted by the lack of affordable housing that is available. Sheryll and Sue and John, I wanted to just hear whether you had any additional insights, right, into what advocates are doing successfully across the country to really kind of combat this NIMBY opposition as we wrap up.
I guess I can kind of jump in there really quickly. And I just wanted to, Fountain View is the central theme here, but Fountain View was also a catalyst for the shift that we are now seeing in the city when it comes to the siting and the support of low-income housing tax credit deals. But that would not have happened had the organization I was with at the time, Texas Housers, had not filed an administrative HUD complaint citing fair housing violations. And also, it just so happened that we videoed the entire meeting. So we had actual visuals and the audio to go along with this. So it was not just hearsay. It wasn't just, drafted in a document. So I would just urge folks to, record, as I consistently tell my community members and fellow colleagues, if it's not recorded in some way, shape, or form, it basically didn't happen. But as a result of this, there was a HUD finding, in regard to the Fountain View, saying that it was sustained, and that the city needed to make a better effort at making sure that sites were supported across the city and not concentrated in low-income communities of color. And so what's happened now is the housing department within the city of Houston has created a new scoring matrix for developments. So it's not just, it's not supposed to just be based on, whose partner or whose pal is proposing a project and pushing projects out. But it's a system where if a project is in a close proximity of a well-rated school, then you get more points. If it's in a community where there's lower concentration of poverty, you get more points. So I will say it's much better, but it has not totally solved the problem, but at least it's a step in the right direction. And yes, we were at the table to help draft that as well, to keep them honest and keep them to remember, why we were even at this point.
I just want to say one thing on that real quick. At community meetings where the opposition to certain ordinance about affordable housing is discriminatory in nature, and the public body of city council, say, is sympathetic to this discriminatory opposition, even though they pass an ordinance that is race neutral on its face, courts hold that they adopt the discriminatory animus of the opposition as evidenced by their sympathy with it at the meeting. So therefore, that turns something that's race neutral on its face into something that has a racist component because of the dynamics of that meeting.
Thank you, John. And I think that's an important point. As a fair housing lawyer myself, I am shocked but not shocked by the lack of understanding that some of our elected officials have, that they themselves can be liable under the Fair Housing Act and other civil rights laws for siding with the race-based NIMBY opposition. If I were an elected official, I would certainly want to be very clear about that. Unfortunately, we find that even in having these conversations, because I like to make sure that people are clear about that, sometimes the message isn't sinking in, right? And that's an unfortunate reality of doing this work in New Orleans, when the city of New Orleans itself has already been sued, right, for decisions that the city council made in 2012 that the Obama Justice Department, right, really alleged aligned with the discriminatory opposition. So we're operating in a city where our council has already experienced having litigation brought against them because of siding with race-based, or I'm sorry, it was actually disability-based NIMBYism in that lawsuit. And so it's unfortunate that we still oftentimes have to have conversations with local policymakers about the ways in which the city can be held liable for siding with NIMBY opposition. So we're hearing from Sheryll and John that there are administrative and legal, right, processes that advocates can use when these race-based or disability-based NIMBY groups are really exerting control over the local land use decisions. Sue, I wanted to give you an opportunity to add anything else that you might have as we wrap this conversation up. Nothing else to add, Sue? No? Okay. All right. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up. And again, I want to thank you, these panelists, especially for your patience with us as we got started this morning. But thank you for a really insightful conversation and for helping us to kick off the 15th annual Fit for a King event. So thank you to our panelists. And as we wrap up this first conversation, I am going to turn things over to Sarah Carthen Watson, who is LaFHAC's new legal director, having joined us in March of 2021. Sarah will be experiencing her first Fit for a King as a LaFHAC staffer. Sarah, I will turn things over to you to present the award for courage.
Great, thank you, Kashana. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. If I could ask our awardee, Sarah McDonald, to turn her camera on so we can present the award for courage to her.
Okay, I'm sorry, I was a little unprepared this morning. I apologize.
We're glad to have you here. It's good to see you. So everyone, I want to introduce Ms. Sarah McDonald. And before I get kind of into her story, I just want to highlight how important the award for courage is. When someone experiences discrimination of any form, it can be really hurtful, painful, and often sometimes comes with shame. And folks do not want to share that experience. And it takes a lot of courage to not only share that experience, but to have the determination and the drive to hold whoever committed that discrimination accountable for their actions. And so we wanted to present this award for courage to Ms. Sarah McDonald. And I'll let her share as much of her story as she wants, but just to give you kind of a highlight, Ms. McDonald experienced a lot, her home experienced a lot of damage following one of Louisiana's several hurricanes. And her landlord, rather than following through on his duty to make sure that her home was safe and ready for her to return following the hurricane, chose to offer a quid pro quo sexual harassment situation instead of doing his job as a landlord. And rather than feeling discouraged or ashamed, Ms. McDonald not only reported that discrimination to our office so that we could conduct a full investigation and file a complaint on her behalf, but she also rallied her community. She got a bunch of people via Facebook to report other experiences with the same landlord, and really gave members of her community who'd experienced the same thing a voice and a community to express their experiences. And this experience is not one that is uncommon. In fact, Ms. McDonald's experience represents kind of an overlap of a variety of issues that us at LaFHAC see in our work in terms of issues post-hurricane, landlords abusing their power in various ways. But it really also highlights how we cannot do this work without people who are willing to come forward and willing to stand up for what's right and stand up for their own rights. And so it is my distinct pleasure to present this award, the 2022 Award for Courage, to Sarah McDonald. And I wish I could hand this to you in person, but we will be mailing it to you as soon as possible so you can have it and hang it up wherever you want. And I'll let you say a few words if you want.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much. And, you know, when you say it like that, it makes me a little emotional. So I was over here tearing up. I think you explained it well, and I'm just shocked, and it's great. I'm excited, and, you know, thank you so much for your help. You know, couldn't have done it without you.
We're happy to help. Thank you so much for trusting us with your story and trusting us with your experience that we can try and hold him accountable. Really appreciate it. And thank you for joining us today. And we'll be in touch about mailing the award to you.
Sounds great.
Thank you. And now we'll be moving on to our next panel, which is moderated by LaFHAC's Director of Policy and Communications, Maxwell Ciardulo.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And I'm just going to ask my panelists to turn their video on and unmute themselves. We'll get everybody here. And this is the We Can Stop Evictions Success Stories from the Field panel that we're going to move into next. My name is Maxwell Ciardulo, and I'm the Director of Policy and Communications at LaFHAC. And so great, it looks like we've got almost everybody on here. And as we were first conceptualizing this panel, I knew that I wanted it to be at least a little bit celebratory and optimistic. This might be to some extent influenced by the fact that I just finished Station 11 on HBO Max, if anyone else has been watching that. For those who haven't seen it, it's based on a book written in 2014 about a deadly flu pandemic that wipes out 99% of humanity. And when I tell most people that, they're like, nope, not for me, not right now. And that is totally understandable. But the series is actually quite beautiful and hopeful in that it shows a possibility of community, care, compassion, and art after the apocalypse. And so thankfully we're not in that position, but the last 2 years have been exhausting. And this work can be exhausting. And sometimes when advocates like us get up and talk about it, we end up sounding really cynical and jaded and focus entirely on the negative. And so I didn't want that to be the focus of this panel. Instead, we want to celebrate what we've accomplished under incredibly difficult circumstances and share some possibilities for the future and how we can all be a part of the next successes. And so we've got a really amazing panel who can help do this. And I'm going to give brief introductions here, and then we're going to jump into some questions. So our first panelist is Rashida Phillips, who currently serves as the Director of Housing at PolicyLink, a national research and action institute dedicated to advancing racial and economic equity. She also recently served as Managing Attorney of Housing Policy at Community Legal Services in Philadelphia, where she worked for over a decade providing representation and advice to low-income tenants. And then we also have Tricia Lamoza, who is the coordinator of the Jane Place Neighborhood Sustainability Initiative's Eviction Court Monitoring Project. For folks who aren't familiar, Jane Place is a local community land trust that also organizes and advocates for housing justice. She first moved to New Orleans shortly after Katrina to help out her younger sister and her sister's new baby, who were living in a dangerous and substandard home. And that experience helped propel her toward the Eviction Court Monitoring Project, where she has personally monitored over 1,000 eviction cases in New Orleans First City Court over the last year and a half. Dacre Jones is also with us, who's the Community Engagement Coordinator and lead organizer at Jane Place. Dacre is a New Orleans local, born and raised in the city, and they've been part of various radical bookstores, libraries, and protest movements ranging from Occupy to Black Lives Matter, and organizations like Books to Prisoners. And in addition to being a member of the Renters' Rights Assembly, Dacre also creates storytelling performances and is planning on a project uniting storytelling and housing justice. And then lastly, we have Frank Southall, who is a housing justice and political organizer who currently works with Jane Place, helping with outreach, communications, and organizing strategies. And he's been involved in racial and housing justice organizing for nearly 20 years, is a member of the Renters' Rights Assembly here, and also serves on the boards of the Orleans Parish Prison Reform Coalition and the New Orleans Food Cooperative. So thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to start asking some questions to our panelists. And if you have questions, please drop them into the Q&A and we'll try and we'll see if we can get to some of them at the end if we have some time. And so despite opening this by talking about the positive, I do want to at least set the scene here by asking about what eviction court actually looks like, because I think there's probably a lot of people who haven't spent much time in eviction court, if any, and aren't really familiar with what that process looks like, what it looked like before the pandemic and post-pandemic, sort of who is most likely to end up in eviction court and how that's changed. And so Rashida, I'm going to start with you to share a little bit about what that's looked like in your experience in Philadelphia. And then Tricia, I'll come to you to talk about it here in New Orleans.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on the panel today. So I'm just going to start off with talking about Philly a little bit, and then I'll briefly give a picture of the national outlook on evictions. In Philadelphia, much like the rest of the country, we were dealing with an eviction crisis well before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, we saw on average about 22,000 eviction filings a year prior to implementing a local right to counsel program. And then we saw a significant drop in evictions down to about 18,000 a year, but it was still a very high number, right? And so the highest rates of filings occurred in Black and Brown communities. We saw about 71% of those eviction filings, regardless of income, occurring in Black and Brown communities, which really tells us, right, that it's not just, what we were hearing a lot was that it's a poverty issue. People are ending up in eviction court because they're low income, but really, right, it's a gender justice issue. It's a race issue. It's an issue of habitability and substandard housing. And then when the pandemic occurred, right, we saw a very, very significant drop in eviction filings, but still disproportionate impact in Black and Brown communities. Part of the reason for that drop in eviction filings was because of the various moratoria, but it was also because Philadelphia came together as a community and really pushed for specific emergency housing protections during the pandemic. And so because of that, we saw in the past couple of years since the pandemic, about 5,000 eviction filings. That's because we were able to implement very quickly a eviction diversion program, which had not existed in Philadelphia prior to the pandemic, that was mandatory and pre-filing. And so that meant that landlords were required to apply for this diversion program and go through it prior to being able to file in landlord-tenant court. And so with that, we saw about a 90% success rate in about 2,500 cases that have been through that diversion program since the pandemic started, which is really significant. And so also I'll note that we were really able, just to speak to your question about how court has changed, what's been happening in court, we were really able to advance really significant court reform during this time. There's a lot of different considerations that I know lots of people are dealing with around state courts, what's authorized at the local level, just all of these different tensions and entanglements, and sort of various degrees of courts pushing back or just going with whatever they're told. And so in Philadelphia, we were able to get some investigative reports that came out during the pandemic. These things were years in the making, but when they came out at a time that really helped to shift the court practices. We were able to get a new president judge who believed in diversion, who believed in working with landlords and tenants to improve the process and really expanding the awareness of fair housing issues within the landlord-tenant court. So those are just some of the things that we saw. I'll talk more later, but just quickly want to just talk about at the national level, the Eviction Lab is a place that folks can go to look at if you want to see about national level statistics. In a typical year, they average that landlords file about 3.7 million evictions a year. With the moratoria in place last year, they said that the US has seen about 1.5 million fewer eviction filings than normal, which is about 49% of the historical average. So really what we want to hear, right? We want to see these trends continue, but also have to say, right, but that looking at the number city by city, there are concerns about places where renters have fewer legal protections that are still seeing the same levels of eviction filings.
Thanks so much, Rashida. And Tricia, you, as your bio mentioned, you've sat through over 1,000 eviction cases in New Orleans City Court. You spent hours upon days in there. Can you just give folks a sense of sort of what that feels like to be in court, about the sort of like emotional and sort of other scenes that people are seeing in court and that you witness every day?
Sure. Actually, since I gave you that number a couple weeks ago, I'm now up to over 1,300 cases in court, which, if you can believe it, is really only about half of the evictions that are going on. You know, the cases are, you know, some are quick and some are wild and they're unconscionable, and some, you know, some might say are justified, but no matter what, they're always emotional and gut-wrenching and life-altering. You know, what we do is just sit and take notes, but being in that courtroom is watching case after case where people lives are being changed and it being so matter of fact in the courtroom is insane. I wasn't involved in the project yet before COVID, but I asked Madeline, who was the coordinator at that time, and she said that pre-pandemic, she was seeing as many as 60 cases a day and sometimes more, and cases would go so fast. They were on average about 2 minutes, and they were trying to capture what happened between the judges, the plaintiffs, and the tenant. The main thing that was going on then, and still is a major problem, is that, you know, like 1/3 of the people who were being evicted came to court at all. And a lot of that was because it was just hopeless. Like there was no reason. Of the 671 cases that they saw pre-pandemic that Jane Place was able to monitor, over 500 of them were evicted. So that, I mean, why even go to court, right? But the pandemic changed things a bit. The number of cases dropped, obviously, because there was safety concerns, but it meant that the judges were able to devote more time to each case. And there were protections put in place, and now there's the emergency rental assistance. So there's some recourse for the tenants, but court is still like an incredibly, it's just like an unbalanced power game. On the one hand, the tenants come into the courtroom and they're fighting for their lives, for their livelihood, for their security. They're tentative and they're scared, and they walk in not knowing what's going to happen or what to do. And then on the other hand, you have the landlords or property managers who like barge in, and they're confident and they're comfortable and they're making small talk with the court workers. They're asking after grandkids and giving congratulations on this or that. And sometimes some are worse than others in that vein, but it's always very evident, and it can feel very much like it is the court and the landlord versus the tenant. And through this pandemic and through the changes that we've made, more tenants are coming in represented, like a ton more. Before pandemic, there were only about 30 of those 670 cases where the tenant was represented, and we're much higher than that. It's more in the 60 to 70% of them do. And then having a lawyer in the room changes the dynamic completely, immediately, without any question. That the power equalizes. Having someone advocate for the tenant slides the judge to a more neutral position in a way that there's someone to actually argue the merits of the case. Because in Louisiana, a landlord has every right to ask for a 24 eviction without for any reason. And unless the defendant can give just cause, they'll get it. Tenant after tenant gets bulldozed by the landlords just for non-payment because they didn't ever hear of the CDC declaration, or for lease violations, or terminated leases without proper notice and whatever. And the landlords just get it because there's nobody that knows what they're looking for. To be fair, it's happening less and less. And I like to think that has a little something to do with us being in the room, watching, and during the moratorium, landlords had to get real creative with their evictions because they weren't able to evict for non-payment. And having a lawyer was the only way to find these little technicalities that were the line.
I'm afraid we may have lost Trisha there, but Trisha, are you back?
Am I here?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. But I really appreciate everything that you shared there. I think that was a really helpful sort of picture of what court actually looks like for folks, how quickly it moves, how stressful it is, and how sort of final those determinations are. I want to move and just come to Frank for a second. And also our interpreters have asked us to just be mindful of how quickly we're talking so that they can keep up with us. So Frank, I want to talk a little bit also about how evictions impact people moving forward after there's an eviction that has happened, what that means to have that on their record, and how it impacts them when they seek new housing, and who that disproportionately impacts.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And thank you. It's a blessing to be with everyone on this panel. They talk about this issue. Getting eviction on your record relatively anywhere in the US is like the scarlet letter. It prevents you from accessing quality, safe housing. In addition to all the other requirements it takes to rent, safe, equitable housing. Having eviction on your record is as damaging as having a low credit score. And, you know, surprise, surprise, we know that this disproportionately affects Black women the most. Jane Place actually has data that from our eviction court monitoring project before the pandemic that I think 56% of all people who were facing eviction were Black women in court from the court monitoring project, and 82% were Black in general. So we obviously know, like, you know, as Rashida mentioned, you know, when we think about evictions, it's not just like this economic issue, it's a race, a gender issue as well. And so, you know, we see a lot of people shut out of safe housing once they get eviction on their record. In particular with this pandemic, a lot of people were facing eviction due to the fact that literally their workplaces were closed for, you know, 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, or maybe they were living with folks where if they went out into the workforce, the chance of them catching COVID could have been a moment of, you know, passing on death to a loved one, an elderly loved one, or someone immunocompromised. So Black women are definitely the ones who are most impacted by evictions, like full stop in New Orleans. And I would venture to say also nationwide, Black women are the most impacted by evictions as well.
Thanks, Frank. And Rashida, did you have anything you wanted to add from your experience in Philadelphia?
Yeah, I think Frank really said it all, right? In an eviction record, it comes with a scarlet letter, no matter what the outcome of the case is. Even for tenants who are never actually evicted, right? The tenant might have won their case, they might have entered into an agreement, they could walk hand in hand out of the courtroom with their landlord, right? And that record will follow them for the rest of their lives. And it's in some ways, it is very much like a criminal record, right? As Matt Desmond talks about, Black and Hispanic men are locked up, Black and Hispanic women are locked out. It's a very parallel process in terms of the impact of that record on a person's future possibilities to access housing, to access stable, you know, to education, all of those different things. It has that lifelong, life-changing impact. It is not just at the point of the eviction, at the point of being kicked out, it's that record that also follows folks. In Philadelphia, we were able to do some work around this particular area. In some places, folks are able to get their records sealed, meaning taken off of view or closed so that certain people can't access them. We fought for that kind of protection in Pennsylvania, but we're not able to achieve it. And so in the meantime, what we were able to do at the local level was to get a tenant screening policy in place that that said for landlords that they could not have these kind of policies where they have a blanket eviction ban. And so, for example, in Philadelphia, where you see, like Frank talked about, in Philadelphia, we also see that Black women are disproportionately impacted by eviction records. They represent over 74% of the cases that end up in landlord-tenant court. And so, inevitably, when those folks are trying to look for housing, they are the ones who are being denied because of that eviction record, because of what the tenant screening score says. And so, the law, in a nutshell, says that, right, landlords cannot have policies where they're saying you have one or more eviction record, we're not going to consider your application. Landlords in Philadelphia now have to do a holistic review of a tenant's application. They cannot look at certain eviction records. So at the federal level, your eviction record can be reported on your tenant screening report or your credit report for up to 7 years. And so in Philadelphia, with that new law in place, landlords can't look back more than 4 years. They cannot look at eviction records that came up during the COVID-19 emergency period and pandemic, as Frank talked about. For a lot of families, right, this is a critical period where they lost income, various things happen, and they have these now. We have even more people with these eviction records. So it does a couple of other things, and it also gives the tenant an opportunity to request a reconsideration of their application if they've been denied due to one of those reasons, or and can also request that a landlord hold or put their name on a list for a unit if they deny them mistakenly due to a record that they shouldn't have looked at. So that's the law in a nutshell, and one of the ways that we've tried to address this issue in Philadelphia.
Thank you, Rashida. And I love that we're sort of starting to get into the optimistic piece of this and the some of the successes we've already had. I'll actually share one quick story too. We worked with a woman from the Baton Rouge area last year who was evicted during the pandemic, actually during one of the moratoriums, so her eviction should not have moved forward, but it did. And so she spent last Thanksgiving with her, 2 kids and her elderly parents in a single, hotel room, and was there for 45 days. And the first place that she tried to apply for was another apartment complex in the area. She had, hustled and maintained a couple of jobs despite losing a lot of income. So had income, and the apartment complex had vacancies and said, we'd love to have you. And you can move in today, but we're gonna run, we're gonna do a credit and background check. And if we find an eviction, we'll ask you to move out in 24 hours. And so she was barred from that place. And she actually became one of our sort of advocates at the legislature to help improve some of that. But my next question and what I want to talk about here, we've already touched on this a little bit, but it's sort of about why I think we sometimes separate sort of renter protections and eviction defense from fair housing work. But I think we need to start thinking about them as very connected and part of the same work. And one of the ways I'll just share about that is, Rashida, the ban on, or the sort of making sure that landlords can't use a blanket ban on evictions is very similar to the federal guidance about criminal backgrounds, right? Which is that you can't have a blanket ban on arrests or a blanket ban on convictions because that would violate the Fair Housing Act. And so it's really exciting that Philadelphia has done that as well. So I'm interested in hearing from all of you about this, about sort of how we connect renter protections and fair housing work. But Dacre, I'll start with you. And then let other folks jump in.
Yeah, I feel like when people who have been marginalized from society, you'll find that most of them, or a lot of people, are more likely to be renters. These protections are going to protect everyone, including them. A lot of discrimination that you see happen, a lot of unfair expectations from people. You see that it is you'll see that it's presented with coded language. You'll see that it's presented in various ways that might not be outright discriminatory from an outside perspective, but they have uneven consequences. And I feel like the protections that we give across the board inevitably affect people who might be marginalized because of, their skin color or because of their gender identity, or especially in our work, we see a lot of people who are elderly and disabled. They have fewer protections. It's harder for them to navigate the system. So really fighting for protections and fighting for eviction defense generally, it's a way to capture people across the board. You don't have to be very explicit about discriminating against someone. You don't have to be explicit in your policy to really have unequal consequences across the board for people.
Yeah, thank you. And Frank, can you actually just talk a little bit about some of the work that I know that you help organize around non-English speakers in the emergency rental assistance program, because I know that's another place where I feel like there's a lot of overlap here.
Yeah, so a few members of the Renters Assembly very early on in the pandemic set up a Spanish hotline to basically help primarily monolingual Spanish speakers. A lot of folks are undocumented, just get like their questions answered and get connected resources. And so basically what happened was that when Biden came into office and he expanded rental assistance to individuals who were undocumented, basically what a few of our folks, Jay, Sheryll, and Katie found is that people are calling them, telling them like, hey, we're not going anywhere with this. So basically they got all those families, individuals together, created a WhatsApp group, and basically just so people could share their struggle and story. And then basically in that WhatsApp group, people start organizing together. And so folks organize the Spanish hotline folks organized folks to go to City Hall repeated times. As opposed to direct assistance, Jay went with folks at Office Community Development to basically literally walk people through the process. And so I think by doing that, it sped up. My particular opinion is it sped up how rental assistance was being dispersed, because I think that people realize in City Hall that people need this now. And I think that's one of the reasons why the federal government is giving us so much more money, because we now have this model to get money out. At first, people directly impacted weren't being listened to. And then the city started listening to people because people were organizing. And now they created like some best practices to get money out really quickly. So I think that was one of the most beautiful things seen from like Renters' Rights Assembly members working with community, undocumented folks to get this money out ASAP, and to empower and build agency collectively for folks.
Awesome, thank you for sharing that. So I want to now talk sort of more explicitly about some of the wins that we've had. Obviously, we all believe housing should be a human right. And as we work towards that, though, we've already, I think, started to make some shifts in people's understanding of evictions. We had some accomplishments in stopping evictions and mitigating their impact. So Rashida, you've talked a little bit about some of the successes that have happened in Philadelphia. Do you want to just connect some of those or flesh out any more of them a little more?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of what my co-panelists have talked about are the solutions that need to be uplifted and spread, right? Quite frankly, things like right to counsel. And part of how we thought about it in Philadelphia is that we sort of strategized around 3 specific areas, which is right to counsel, eviction records, and diversion, as 3 interconnected ways to approach the issue of the eviction crisis that all really fed into each other. And so, having a diversion program helps folks to avoid that record. It helps folks who don't need, to be in eviction court, who shouldn't be there, to be able to try to work or attempt to work things out with the landlord, whether it's about just rebuilding that relationship, or the landlord's not being responsive to things and you're actually withholding your rent. You're not just, not paying the rent. Whatever it is, having a space where you can avoid that eviction record and you can try to work through your landlord-tenant issues, right? But diversion alone is not enough, because we know that some landlords are not going to go through it. They're not going to do what they say that they're going to do, whatever the case may be. Some situations just are not appropriate for diversion. Some situations, you need a lawyer, you need your day in court, you need the court to enforce and do what it's going to do. And so having a right to counsel paired with a diversion program, making sure that there's a pipeline that if things don't work out in diversion or things don't go that route, that you do have someone who is going to be able to help someone access the processes of landlord-tenant court. What my co-panelists talked about earlier, Tricia, about the unfairness of that court, about the power imbalance there. You need, most people will need an attorney or someone who's going to be able to assist them through that, navigating that process and be able to access their rights. And so having a right to counsel that's paired along with diversion court. And then finally, right, that last component of the eviction record. Again, like I talked about earlier, you can go to landlord-tenant court. There are some situations where a tenant is going to win, especially if they have an attorney, right? But you still have that record, unfortunately, no matter what the outcome of that case is. So having mechanisms that allow for that record to be sealed, for landlords to not be able to consider those records is really important to have paired alongside of those other 2 things. And so again, right to counsel, diversion, addressing the issue of eviction records is a start, right, to sort of shifting the system in a way that impacts families and Black communities in particular, Black and brown communities in particular.
Awesome. And we're not quite as far along in New Orleans as Philadelphia is, but we have had some incredible successes over the past year. And I think some of that really started with the court monitoring program. And so Tricia, I'm gonna ask you to talk for a minute just about sort of how that changed things. And then I wanna come to Frank and Daiquiri to talk about the early eviction notification system and the right to counsel win that and sort of how those things work together. So Tricia, why don't you start?
Yeah, definitely I would say that having us in that room really like just being in there, it's like a small motivator for everyone involved to behave with a little bit more awareness. And, you know, just taking notes makes them behave differently. Judges will like glance at me when they've done something that they're either really proud of and they're like, hey, do you see that? Or they're like, hope she didn't notice that, you know, where somebody who's new, when I was newer, I didn't catch all of the things that they were allowing into court. And as I got in there, I started catching the, you know, and then asking them about it, like, wasn't that hearsay? And then, you know, that sort of definitely, I mean, I've seen the change in them, but on a larger scale, the data that we collect, you know, within that same data, we were given the solution to the problem, you know, like cases where the tenant was represented had better outcomes. So obviously, like, everyone should have a lawyer. Cases where the tenants come to court have a better outcome. So we need to get more tenants into court. And those are the things that got the right to counsel spark, and the things that got our early notification eviction postcards like sparked and turned into a reality. And yeah, that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And then either Dak or Frank, feel free to pick up from there.
In terms of the early eviction notification system, well, one, I've seen even council members reference the data. So that's, you know, exciting that the data is being seen and listened to. But in terms of other projects that come out of that, even with the early eviction monitoring system, I got a call the other day, and it was such a relief. The first thing that someone, the first piece of information someone received about getting an eviction was, you know, an ask if for you know, if you need assistance, you know, do you need to talk to a lawyer? Do you need to talk to someone? And I think that makes a major difference when people see that someone is, whether it's in court, you know, keeping eyes on the process, or, you know, if someone is, you know, alerting you and reaching out to you when you are faced with this life-changing situation. I think that, you know, not only does that make a material difference in the world, but also I think emotionally for tenants, it makes a big difference also.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, the flow of the conversation, because the eviction court monitoring project was one of the first projects that got started, you know, when Jane Place was just like, hey, we're going to do more, you know, robust renters' rights work. We're going to work with the New Orleans Renters' Rights Assembly to like make it happen, right? And so then we've been like, wait, like we're monitoring this data, but we need to get in front of it. It actually was like a combination ideal that like Trisha, Madeline, and I like thinking about like, how do we do this? It got birthed. Like, you know, Trisha was just like, we need to send mail to people, and we just can't put like letters on people's doors because landlords would take them down. And then like the ideal of the postcard came. And so then we went like, all right, we have the data from what happens when people get evicted, when they're in the court. We're notified people before, but what's missing? The lawyer piece. And so I'm just really excited. I'm still a little bit shocked that we won right to counsel, because I was just like, this is going to take 3 years to make it happen. But I think due to the relationships we built, not just in community, in coalition with other organizations, such as like, you know, LaFHAC, obviously, but also like the willingness and observations of our city council go like, oh, wait, if they're telling us we should do this, we should do it. I think it made it possible to get this $2 million funded, which was like above and beyond what we thought it would be. I think it's going to have a major impact, because most folks, like, you know, 100% people are going to be covered. And then there's going to be a lot more education, outreach opportunities coming from all the different groups working, such as Jane Place, LaFHAC, you know, SOS, just educating the public about their rights. And so I think we'll start to see the turn tide when it comes to just some of the abuse we see from landlords to tenants. I think we'll start to see things start to norm in the way that we see or not norm, because nowhere in America is so perfect, but we'll see better outcomes from tenants facing eviction. So I'm really excited as it leads us into the next bucket of work we're doing.
Thanks, Frank. Okay, we're getting near the end, and I want to save at least a minute or two because we did get one good question that I want to come to. But I want you all to each take just a minute, and we'll go around and hear sort of what do you think our next steps should be and how people can get involved in this. So Rashida, why don't you start?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard to kind of say on a national level what the next steps are, but I think what I am seeing and where we need to continue to put the pressure on is to really expand our notions of fair housing. And to understand who fair housing, who is disproportionately impacted by fair housing, keep uplifting that. I mean, I remember there was a time when I was doing this work 5 or 6 years ago where you couldn't really talk. I mean, race was not a part of it. It was not a part of the discussion. It was not being talked about in the media about who was disproportionately impacted. And now we can have these conversations. It is becoming more normalized to talk about who is being disproportionately impacted by things like housing instability and housing insecurity. So we need to keep the pressure on and continue to have these conversations. That's a start. If we can sort of align ourselves nationally, at least around the message, around the narrative that we want to push forward, then minds and hearts can change from there. But if we're still going off those same old stale narratives, I think, right, we're going to continue to be in the same situation. One thing I'm really also interested in continuing to talk about is sort of our values around what we even want to see in terms of housing. You know, a lot of folks talk about this sort of, what do they call it? The home ownership, well, the Black wealth gap, which is really important, right? But there's also a Black health gap. There's also, when we talk about intergenerational wealth, we have to talk about intergenerational health and not just poverty, right? A very expansive notion of health. It's not just physical bodily health, but it's people's ability to thrive, people's ability to be connected to their culture, to their community, to have options of where they want to live in the world, right? So just all of these different things that we need to uplift alongside of obviously the policies and the laws and all of those different things. But we can only do that when we have these kinds of conversations and when it's not just the people at the top determining what you know, where the values lie and where the policies go, but it has to be done with the people on the ground, the tenants themselves, right? The folks who are most impacted, organizers, advocates, all of us need to continue to come together and do what we're doing. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. And I apologize, but for the sake of time, maybe Frank or Daiquiri, one of y'all could speak for Jane Place about sort of next steps and what you see on the horizon and how people can get involved also.
Yeah, I can go really quickly. So next steps is habitability and landlord retaliation. That's what we're going to be working on the next 2 years. It's going to be a major shift in housing policy if we win this. And so one of the ways you can get involved is, you know, if you're a renter, working class homeowner, if you're someone who is unhoused or has any type of housing instability, you can attend our renter strike assembly on the first Wednesday of the month, as well as getting to work. And then I'm going to quickly plug it to Daiquiri because Daiquiri is the man who you will contact.
February 2nd. Visit our page on Facebook. But really quickly, to tie into what was just said about that larger conversation happening, we see 10,000 members on Bad Landlords now. That community is growing. People are having that conversation. And that conversation is really what we're going to be building off of as we, you know, bring forth a Healthy Homes ordinance, which is our major plan over the next few months, a couple years.
Awesome, thank you. And I'll just flesh that out quickly, right? In New Orleans, but in Louisiana for sure, but in New Orleans, there is no way to hold the landlord accountable for deferring maintenance, for all sorts of serious health and safety violations. And Jane Place and Fair Housing have been working on this for the better part of a decade, and it's time we're actually going to get it done. So that's definitely going to be our next big move. So we had one question that I want to pull from the Q&A, which is, given the lack of tenant rights and landlord oversight in Louisiana, which is certainly true, Is there a comprehensive guide that exists for landlords who want to make sure that they are operating in a fair, legal, and just way? Jane Place folks, do you know of resources out there for landlords who want to be on the right side of this?
So in terms of law, there's a guide. I'm sure one of the SOS folks can come up with the correct name, but it's called Moving In, Moving Out. It was created by like the Attorney General a couple years ago. So it explains briefly like what are some of the rights and responsibilities of landlords and tenants, but it's not comprehensive. And from my belief, it's not more of a moral document in terms of how you should treat your tenants. So that's something that we're interested in working on, you know, such as having a model lease that we could promote to community, because Jane Place isn't just a housing rights organization, we're a community land trust principally. We build affordable housing, so we are developers. We are technically landlords, and so we have our leases, and so we want to promote that to the world, like, you know, our practices and what we do to keep our tenants stable, especially through economic instability that we've experienced. So yeah, and I'll probably search her and just drop in the chat, but it's like bookmark on my phone, or not phone, but computer.
Awesome. The other resource that I know that Jane Place has been talking about at some point making the lease that it uses available to landlords who want to do the right thing. And so that's something that hopefully will be available soon. And then the other resource that I can share is one that Southeast Louisiana Legal Services puts together. It's sort of an online site that is primarily for renters and other folks who are dealing with the legal system. But I think it could be a good guide for landlords who want to do the right thing as well. And it's louisianalawhelp.org. So that might also be a useful guide. And so I just want to thank a moment here and really thank our panelists for joining us. This has been really amazing, and we really appreciate all of your contributions. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. And so we're going to move in. I'm going to stay with y'all. We're going to move into our next segment on the agenda, which is our Mondale Brook Award. And so I'm going to ask Representative Royce Duplessis to turn his video on and join us. Hey, Royce. Welcome.
Hey, Max. Good morning.
Good morning. So the award that we're presenting today is the Mondale Brook Award, and the award is named after Senators Walter Mondale and Edward Brooke, who worked diligently to make the Fair Housing Act a reality and who finally succeeded in 1968, a week after Dr. King's assassination. And we present this award each year because though we know that change is made by movements and by a lot of the folks who you just saw on the last panel, we also know it is greatly assisted by smart and savvy policymakers. And so this award is specifically for policymakers who've distinguished themselves as champions of civil and housing rights. And so this year's awardee is State Representative Royce Duplessis, whose district stretches from Central City in the Lower Garden District to the 7th Ward and St. Roch in New Orleans. And prior to serving in the legislature, Royce worked as special counsel for the Louisiana Supreme Court, where he championed criminal justice reform after observing the human impact of inequalities in our criminal justice system. He also served as chairman of the New Orleans City Planning Commission, where he was always a reliable vote in favor of affordable housing and against NIMBYism, and we miss him there. But we understand that he's got bigger and better things to do. And he's also a past president of the Louis A. Martinet Legal Society. And since 2012, he's volunteered as a mentor to teenagers through the nationally renowned Silverback Society. And the particular efforts we want to lift up and honor for today is his tenacity last year in getting a new renter protection bill through the legislature, despite fierce opposition from local and national lobbying groups. The bill was initially designed to ensure that families who faced eviction during the pandemic wouldn't be haunted by that record for years into the future, which is exactly what we were just talking about on this last panel. And so I approached Royce about carrying the bill because I know he's one of the legislators who really only knows how to give you full commitment. He gets into every detail and wants to make sure that he can explain it himself. which in this case means that he basically became an expert on the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act. And as many of you know, it's near impossible to go up against a business lobby in Louisiana and win. But thanks to his skilled negotiations, some excellent testimony from who were most affected, we were able to get our bill passed out of its first committee hearing over the objections of the apartment and realtor lobbies, as well as the National Credit Reporting Lobby. So Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax were against us, and we still got this out of committee. And so last year was, it was my 7th year at the legislature doing this work, and that's the first time I've ever seen that happen. And ultimately that forced a compromise and ensured the final passage of the bill, which is now law, and requires any apartment that wants to charge you an application fee to disclose whether it may use eviction records, criminal records, or credit scores to deny you. It also requires apartments that charge a fee to give applicants an opportunity to explain any hardships they may have experienced, like an eviction, and how they might have been related to the pandemic or a hurricane. So this is an important new protection, and they're very hard to come by in the state. So Royce, we really thank you for your commitment to housing justice, and we will be delivering this this award to you in short order. But thank you. Please feel free to say a few words.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, Louisiana Fair Housing, and the boss, Kashana Hill, and your incredible work. You know, this is truly a collaborative effort. I was really excited when Max approached me about the bill, because I had followed some of the debate in previous sessions. A lot of the groundwork had already been laid, and we were able to go back and look at previous testimony where you had opponents who had agreed that there were certain flaws with the way that it was being done, and who recognized that someone's previous eviction record should, as a result of some disaster or something that was out of their control, should not haunt them, and that we should have a system in a way where they could at least explain themselves and they're not automatically stricken from consideration. So we were able to bring those kind of things up in negotiations, but that was only because Max and his team and some of my colleagues before me had already been working at issues that were sort of around this. But when we got in committee, it was a fight. They didn't want to hear it because oftentimes, if you've ever been to the state capitol, there isn't a great sense of putting policies first that promote people, and people who are vulnerable, and people who are on the margins, and people who are just trying to make it. And that's a big part of the reason why I chose to go into public service, is to try to push policies that put people first. And this organization and this collaborative of organizations around fair housing, that's exactly what you all are about. So I was just really honored to work alongside Max. We had some very, very difficult, they were really, really dead set on trying to kill this bill. We were getting to a point where they didn't even, we had it scheduled, and then they pulled it off the agenda. We didn't understand why. So we had to navigate all of that, but we ultimately got it through. Max was incredibly patient, and I think we made a good team, and I was happy that we could get a win for the people. And also, I cannot go without saying the testimony from the people from the community who had experienced this. I think Miss Ariel is her name. She was just amazing. But to be able to tell those stories for people who had been impacted, that's really I think just played a crucial role. So look, I'm always going to be on the side of fair housing. And my district right now, we're going through redistricting. It's forced me to take another hard look at the district I represent, which includes the CBD of New Orleans, Central Business District, Warehouse District, French Quarter, Tremay, 7th Ward, St. Roch, Lower Mid-City, Lower Garden District, Central City. These are all neighborhoods we're familiar with, but we're also very familiar with the housing challenges that exist in these neighborhoods. These neighborhoods also house many of the tourism jobs that many people work in, but can't afford to live in the same district in which they work. So, you know, these are all challenges. I know that Louisiana Fair Housing is leading and trying to close those equity gaps around housing. And I'm just so grateful that you all are there with us, because just like it's not easy for us to be up there every day, it's not easy for you all to be up there every day fighting these fights. So I appreciate that, and I salute you, and I thank y'all for this honor.
Thanks so much, Royce. Always a pleasure working with you, and definitely appreciate you lifting up the sort of teamwork that really got this done. So thank you. And I think we're going to move into our next panel. And Sarah Carthen-Watson is going to jump on to moderate that.
Thanks, Maxwell. We could have our remaining panelists come off mute and turn their cameras on. That'd be great. We'll go ahead and get started. So we're looking for Dion, Dylan, and Gabrielle. Great. Good to see you all. Hi. Good morning again, everyone. Thanks so much for sticking with us this morning. We are on to our final panel of the day before our keynote presentation. And this panel is titled Decriminalizing Identity, Strategies to End Disproportionate Criminalization. And so as LaFHAC's legal director, you know, this is an issue that is really near and dear to us. We see this a lot in our work across our various enforcement activities, which includes litigation, fair housing testing, and representing clients in HUD or LADOJ investigations. We encounter the harms of overcriminalization of marginalized groups very frequently. For example, a LaFHAC mystery shopper investigation showed that discrimination against people with criminal justice involvement is often used as a covert way to discriminate based on race. Almost half the time, LaFHAC's white mystery shoppers who said they had a criminal background were treated with more leniency than equally qualified Black applicants. We also continue to come across housing providers that have blanket bans against those with criminal records, policies that have a significant impact based on race. And given the prevalence of these issues and the impact they have on so many communities, we are so excited to have this amazing panel of experts here to discuss overcriminalization and its impact on access to housing for marginalized groups. Before we hear directly from our panelists, I just want to remind everyone that you can put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to it during our session. Feel free to indicate if that question is directed at a specific panelist, and we'll be sure to continue monitoring that box. So with that, I will have our panelists start by telling us a little bit about yourself, your work, and how the communities you work with have been historically impacted by overcriminalization. Dylan, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm Dylan Wagasback. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. I am the Senior Public Policy and External Affairs Director at Cindy Lauper's True Colors United. We're a national nonprofit organization working to advance housing justice that focuses on the unique experiences of LGBTQ+ and BIPOC youth and young adults, in particular those with lived experience of homelessness. I also am one of the members of the Founders Circle of House of Tulip here in New Orleans, which is where I'm from, and have pretty extensive lived experience of homelessness myself as well. So the communities that I work with really are made up by the folks that I was just describing, right? People with lived experience of homelessness, primarily LGBTQ and Black young adults, youth and young adults. When I say youth, I'm talking about ages 12 to 17. When I say young adults, I'm talking about 18 to 30, really broadly, right? Knowing that people's experiences with homelessness are often recurring and happen over long periods of time when they start when they're young. And in terms of how these groups of people are historically impacted by overcriminalization, what we see consistently is that the normal adolescent behavior of youth, of young people who are LGBTQ, Black or Indigenous, or some combination of any of those identities is pathologized. And so, you know, we see like normal risk-taking or other sort of like things that we would consider just really typical teenage experiences. And we have these incredibly disparate overreactions to them in sort of system settings. The result of that ultimately is that we see a disproportionality in the number of young people who are LGBTQ or Black or Indigenous youth who are who touch the foster care system, who touch the juvenile justice system, and who experience homelessness. And one of the things that we find is that sort of every one of those experiences or identities that's layered on top of each other, the harder it is for young people to break through some of the barriers and challenges that I'm describing. And so, you know, in particular, we see across the country transgender youth, but in particular Black transgender youth who are at the highest risk of coming into contact with these systems. The other piece of that is the more contact you have with these government systems, the more likely you are to have contact with policing and criminalization, right? If anyone's not super familiar with what it is like to be in a homeless shelter in particular, the police are there like every other day, right? So this is a sort of area where we see just those compounding challenges.
Great, thank you for that. Gabrielle, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Gabrielle Perry. I'm a 29-year-old epidemiologist. I'm a native of Louisiana, born and raised. And I'm also the founder and executive director of the Thurman Perry Foundation. The Thurman Perry Foundation is a Louisiana-based nonprofit. We operate nationally, though, in service of women and girls who have been impacted by incarceration. We are a direct giving organization working to address how the mass incarceration epidemic affects women and girls, particularly, who are honestly too often overlooked in this movement, despite being the fastest growing demographic in America's jails and prisons. Our mission is to ensure that educational resources, direct fiscal resources, public health resources as well are given to these women. We are currently the first and only organization in the entire United States that is addressing period poverty and menstrual inequity directly inside America's women's prisons on a monthly basis, and addressing the healthcare crisis and period poverty amongst incarcerated women via our Girl Code program, which donates organic, cotton, fragrance-free, dye-free, and chemical-free products to women who are incarcerated in Orleans Parish Prison, LCIW beginning in May, and in the DMV area beginning at the end of the year. Through our national scholarship program as well, we're addressing the fact that overcriminalization of women has led to a 27% unemployment rate nationwide for women, and for Black women, that is, I think, 43% unemployment rate for formerly incarcerated Black women in the US. Our program, which is called the Perry Second Chances Scholarship, awards currently incarcerated women, formerly incarcerated women, and the daughters of both demographics direct scholarships to attend 2 to 4 year accredited educational institutions. In fact, next week, I'm so excited, we'll be introducing our most recent cohort, 15 women from 8 states across the country, who are proof that it's not going to be locking people up and throwing away the key that increases public safety or rehabilitates them, but in investing in them and in our communities that fosters public safety.
Thank you. That just, hearing you talk about your work was extremely
thank you.
You can tell, you can feel the passion that you have for this work and the impact that you all are making. So thank you for sharing that with us. And last but not least, Ms. Dion, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work?
Sure. So my name is Dion Haywood. I'm the Executive Director of Women with a Vision here in New Orleans. We've been around for 32 years now. It feels weird to say that, but 32 years. Our work was started just really doing community outreach, harm reduction, and health promotion around HIV and women's health. And after Hurricane Katrina, we realized that we really were going to need to look at policy and advocacy around why people, because we started out using a public health framework, and that was kind of our focus. And we realized that the work we had been doing was really rooted in reproductive justice, harm reduction, drug policy, and looking at ending the epidemic and fighting for LGBTQ rights. And we also felt like at that time, after Hurricane Katrina, which we don't have all day to go through all that, but looking at all the ways that people just weren't nobody gave people an opportunity to be involved in issues that deeply impacted them, their health and their lives. And so the work kind of shifted after that, looking at policy and advocacy as a way to make the changes, but led by the people who were directly affected. And so our whole goal was about working alongside of them. And then in, I want to say 2009, we started looking at how Louisiana's crime against nature laws were affecting trans women, Black trans women, specifically Black women, and gay men around sex work or just at the police discretion. And so we challenged that law and ended up removing over 800 people off the sex offender registry. And it kind of propelled us into like this, this way of looking at not just policy on a state level and changing laws, but how can we do that locally and how can we do that agency-wide, looking at structural racism and criminalization of the groups I just named.
Thank you so much. What an incredible win and incredible work that your organization does. And thank you all for sharing a little bit about yourselves. And so what I heard was, we've got several groups who are experiencing increased access with criminal justice systems. We've got LGBTQ folks, particularly LGBTQ youth. We've got Black trans women, we've got Black women and Black girls who are experiencing higher rates of interaction with the criminal justice system. So how does that translate into access to housing? What are some of the concrete barriers that folks you work with or the communities you serve are facing when it comes to accessing housing as a result of that interaction with the criminal justice system? Anyone want to start?
I can go. So one of the problems, I think, we talk about criminalization, but for me, I believe it has a lot to do with personal policing and just how people think about what people should do and shouldn't do. And so one of the things we saw through No Justice is majority of the people who were convicted or charged with a crime against nature had to follow the national guidelines as a sex offender because you were now in Louisiana considered a sex offender, right? And so that made housing really hard for women and women who had children. And for trans women, it was extremely hard for them to get housing, especially in neighborhoods where they had to get the card that many of us have seen that comes in our mail and actually have you listed as a sex offender. It actually put people at risk and made just everyday people, kind of my neighbors, policing who I am and how I move around, right? How they moved around. The other thing that we see is we see a lot of women who are on Section 8 when they move in certain neighborhoods. We see just the community policing them, where we've had clients where they finally got Section 8 housing. We had a client who had like 4 little boys, right? And her neighbors were calling the police on her on a daily basis because the kids were playing basketball. They were skating or riding their bike. So just the policing of who you are, right? Just a Black woman trying to have safe housing with her kids. And so I feel like one of the biggest, if you think about renting an apartment, we had a young woman, and it has to do more with, I want to say it's race. It's all the things, right? Race, homophobia, transphobia, but also the shame and stigma that we put on people in our community. We had a young woman who had got an apartment in one of the new, in Harmony Oaks, I'll name them because I don't care if that's all right with y'all, but in Harmony Oaks, and or you couldn't have someone of the opposite sex spend the night more than so many nights. You couldn't have, if you did, you can look at being evicted. So it's these ways in which we are policing people and what's considered to be safe housing, but the policing actually has made it unsafe. I'll stop.
I think that's before I let Gabrielle or Dylan jump in, I just want to highlight the personal policing piece there, because one of the kind of emerging areas of fair housing advocacy right now is around nuisance and crime-free ordinances. And I think it's really interesting, not only that, the system of policing already exists to terrorize and criminalize certain groups, but it's the leveraging of that police system by individuals that actually continues to fuel it. So in the nuisance or crime-free example, you may have a housing provider that has a policy, or a municipality that has an ordinance saying that if the police are called to a certain unit or a certain home X number of times in a year, that person can be evicted as a nuisance. So if you have neighbors who are personally policing people, calling the police on people, that could lead to someone being evicted from their home simply by existing. So I think it's really important here. We're talking about these large systems, but they are fueled by individual people who harness that system to continue policing their neighbors or people in their community. Go ahead, Gabrielle.
First, let me say I'm so happy not only this question was asked. Ms. Haywood, listen, you are a woman after my own heart in just the way that you answer that, because that is constantly what I'm always trying to tell people, in that it's not just the system itself that women have to contend with. It is society itself. And that is the compounded issue that women are having to deal with, especially formerly incarcerated women, I think, when it comes to fair housing, because that's really who the population that my organization is having to deal with, especially, like, but be it currently incarcerated, formerly incarcerated women, their daughters, whoever. It's really formerly incarcerated women that are really bearing the brunt of it when it comes to fair housing. And I always tell people, it really starts with this. How do I say this? It's not talked about enough that I want to say this right. Women and girls have different pathways to prison than men do.
Yes.
And these risk differences are contribute to and even compound them not having access to safe and affordable housing.
Yeah.
Now, statistically speaking, we're talking about the last 20 to 25 years of research have proven that really the majority of women, like Ms. Haywood was saying, the majority of women who are incarcerated, we're talking about nonviolent offenders. We're talking about women who are, and I want to preface this by saying, it's not that women are not doing the same thing as men to go to jail. They're doing it for different reasons. The why is different.
Yes.
The why is often different. These women are going to jail, they're selling drugs, they're engaging in property crimes most often, they're engaging in sex work often as a means of either coping with victimization by, like, childhood traumas, things like that, or abuse from an intimate partner. Majority of these women are domestic violence victims. They're sexual abuse survivors. Many are economically motivated because on the outside, they're already being paying less than a man because of the gender pay gap. They're economically motivated to turn to crime by having to care for themselves and their children, often due to poor economic conditions or racism or sexism. And though it may sound like men have the same motivations, social and economic effects are compounding with the carceral system for women, and they're compounding these issues. So that's why when 81,000 women who are released from state prisons every year return to their communities, you don't see halfway houses available for them like the way you do for men. You don't see a surplus of community support. You see people calling the police on them and their kids. You don't see resources offering housing voucher access for formerly incarcerated women, despite the fact that 84% of them are sexual abuse survivors, 64% of them are foster care, coming from the foster care system, 80% of them are domestic abuse survivors. What you do see are communities rallying together to ensure that sex workers aren't allowed in their neighborhood. What you do see is public housing landlords sexually harassing them on Section 8 because they know they have no other housing space to go to. And it's because they are over-criminalized for their traumas that they're shunned from the resources that they need to pick up the pieces of their lives. And what does that lead to? Recidivism.
Yes.
Absolutely. Dylan, would you like to chime in a little bit?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. I want to take us back to the nuisance laws piece too, because I just want to flag that in Louisiana, thankfully in 2015 maybe, our state legislature did pass a law that preempts those local ordinances with the exception of any that had already existed, which is not a great exception to make, but I believe Mandeville was the only city that had one. And so that's not to say that like a city does not now have one, but they are illegal. And so if you hear of one and you want to flag it, I think the folks at the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center would be very interested in hearing about that so that it could be challenged and tossed out, not to volunteer y'all for that work.
Absolutely.
And then in the context of the social policing, we see this so much with young people in particular experiencing homelessness. There is this incredible paternalism built into our homelessness services system that is, you know, historically basically says, like, we know what you need better than you do, and therefore you're not going to have the dignity of choice in the services or the housing that you receive. And that's very much amplified for youth and young adults who also experience sort of the classic sort of adultism where we don't treat young people as though they have agency as a human being. And so with young people who have, who hold identities that experience greater marginalization, we see that show up in the way that they receive services. So LGBTQ plus youth are significantly more likely to be placed in a transitional living program as opposed to a more independent living program when they're receiving services, because they're perceived as like being poorly behaved and requiring greater supervision just because of their sexual orientation or the way that they express their gender, right? And so there's this like way that social policing shows up in services that like ultimately, again, places people at greater sort of surveillance systems, which ultimately exposes them to greater policing and then greater sort of like access to that pipeline to prison that we see that young people experience through all kinds of different systems.
Absolutely.
Can I?
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to quickly say that, I love this panel, by the way. You know, one of the things we see, and we continue to see it, we receive mail from women who are incarcerated all the time, right? And one of the things we get is, I was supposed to be released 6 months ago. I was supposed to be released a year ago, but I have nowhere to go. And we've seen this, especially with women who've been charged across the board, but definitely sex work. And at the time, back then, the crime against nature laws, but it still happens because patriarchy, because it is what it is, men will have some woman, sister, aunt, cousin, mom, grandmother, partner, or partners who will take them in. Women don't get that. Nobody wants to take them in because 9 times out of 10, they always feel like you better get it on your own. Like, we don't hold women and girls, especially Black women and girls, the way we hold men, right? We don't do that. And we've seen so many women just struggling to come home, but you know, you need to have an address. So if they don't have an address and a place to go, they don't come home. And as you heard Gabrielle, you know, we've all said, there are really not that many programs where women can go and be in a halfway house or work their way through whatever systems that I probably wouldn't agree with to have a place to come home. So you have women who are still locked up and have to stay locked up longer because they don't have a place to go. And then when they do come home, the kind of shame and stigma that we put on Black women and girls to be strong, you got to make it. There's really not only is there limited support in terms of systematic services, right? The systems that you're supposed to navigate, there isn't any of that for, you know, in terms of families either. Like, families sometimes tend to treat them the same way systems treat them, right? And so it's really hard for them to be stable and stay out of the system, right? Because we all know how you get trapped in. But I just wanted to say that because when Gabrielle and Dylan was talking, it brought up for me how many people we get letters from. Do you know where I can go? I just need an address. My release date was actually six months ago. And we know that the prison system could care less because they're paid to have you there.
That is such a fantastic point. And I think it really speaks to, no matter what kind of civil rights, social justice issue we're talking about, I often find that it comes back to housing in so many different ways.
Yeah.
Housing is absolutely foundational to life for every single person. It means whether you can access healthy food, it means whether you can access good schools for your kids, whether you can access opportunities for employment. And we're talking about people who are re-entering society from incarceration. You can't do anything without having an address. You have to have an address to even get released, to apply for services, to apply for a job, to apply for a driver's license that you may need to get some type of employment. So absolutely wonderful point. We're talking about a barrier to housing is simply having an address to put down as you're re-entering and trying to navigate all of these systems. Having a physical place to be is really, really, really crucial. Now, we talked about some aspects of overcriminalization that can be a little bit bleak, I'll just say that, but the conversation is not without some wins, right? Like there have been incredible advocates. Ms. Dion, you talked about your work in overturning the Crimes Against Nature law, but there's also some recent wins as well. And so, Gabrielle, I was wondering if maybe you could speak to kind of the work that advocates and people who are formerly incarcerated who have done to lead the charge for reform in Louisiana, including, with support like groups from LaFHAC. But we've won some important protections against housing discrimination, including a model criminal background screening policy at the Housing Authority of New Orleans, and some statewide prohibitions against discrimination based on criminal justice involvement, specifically in subsidized housing. So it'd be great to hear a little bit about kind of what advocates are doing on the ground and some lessons that you can share with advocates around the country who have joined us if they want to work on these issues.
Absolutely. First, let me say that what made many of these wins possible was the dedication, the perseverance of every single person at Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. Policy passages like their Fair Housing and Screen win this past summer, stuff like that don't just happen out of nowhere. I happen to be present for it. I was grateful to be able to testify in support of this passage, both as an advocate and as a formerly incarcerated and formerly houseless woman. And it's just a testament to the work that they do and the care that their advocates have to see, a better Louisiana for all of us. For those who on the call who don't know, the policy itself that was passed, this was back in July, I want to say. It basically brings the state of Louisiana into the Department of Housing and Urban Development's fair housing guidance and compliance with that, something that should have already been happening anyway. But it ensures that everyone in the state of Louisiana seeking housing in any of the 60,000 public housing units and all future units to be built under the Louisiana Housing Corporation's low-income housing tax credit program, one, cannot be discriminated against for a criminal record that did not result in a conviction, for a record that was expunged or vacated, they cannot be discriminated against, for a juvenile record, they cannot be discriminated against, nor anyone living with them cannot be discriminated against, for a criminal conviction after a certain date. So if you had a marijuana conviction at like 17 or something like that, because you are legally an adult at 17, but you're now like 35 trying to get housing in public housing, they cannot discriminate against you for that. What else? It requires that all housing providers also have to weigh any conviction that they do see on your record against a social service program that you completed, a job training program. So what a lot of the courts are doing now is that if you are arrested for drug use or something of that nature, but you complete a drug treatment program, then they'll kind of let you go, they'll let it slide. But what was happening was that, if you apply for public housing and whatnot, the landlords were not letting it slide and they were just throwing those applications out. They can't do that anymore. So it was just a monumental win. And I was happy to even be present for it, just to see it, much less be able to testify in support of it. And I think that it's people like LaFHAC, it's people like organizations like VOTE, organizations like Operation Restoration, who were also there in support of it. I just think that, wins like that don't happen every day, especially in this state. And it just cannot be overstated how monumental it was. I also say what makes the push towards these housing reforms possible is the unprecedented times that we're living in. Mm-hmm. That's educating the public on how housing works. Because I don't think people really knew how housing works and how close one can be to becoming houseless, how overcriminalization and how housing are intertwined, mm-hmm. and how many organizations in their community, like VOTE, like Operation Restoration, like LaFHAC, like everyone on this call and their orgs that are affiliated with and present in helping to fight against housing discrimination for us all, 49% of the residents of the state of Louisiana have a criminal record. Everyone in this state knows somebody who has a criminal record. And that's been a call to action for a lot of people to get involved in reform movements. And in terms of fair housing reform, you can look at the microcosm that is New Orleans. 53% of the city of New Orleans are renters. A high proportion of those renters are living in subsidized housing. So with half of our state and a high percentage of our most populous city are being regarded as unworthy of the most basic human right, and that's housing.
Right.
And I think that that's honestly, you know, woken a lot of people up. It's driven a lot of people to the polls. It has a lot of people donating to community organization. In fact, per Forbes, charitable giving is back to pre-pandemic levels. And so it has just a lot of people asking questions of their elected officials. I mean, we're just in unprecedented times of people realizing that it could always be you.
Yes.
It could always be you. You are not exempt. It could always be you. So I think that that has really pushed people to look at their neighbor and to really want to get involved and just want to push for change. I think that we just live in unprecedented times, and that has pushed for a lot of these wins that we're seeing in the reform movement.
I think you are absolutely right. This pandemic, where, you know, something that is so contagious and so infectious, and the one safe place to be in a pandemic like the COVID-19 pandemic is at home. And I think that message of, oh, just stay home, we're all going to be fine. I think so many people had a new realization that everybody does not have that luxury. You may not have a safe place to call home. If you get COVID, you may not have enough space to isolate from your family. You may not have childcare to keep your, you know, to keep your children out of schools where they might catch coronavirus. So I think you are absolutely right that these times have kind of shifted the public narrative towards a more holistic view of housing, not only that housing is a human fundamental right that everybody deserves access to, but also how access to housing impacts so many other systems and the ways that people try to navigate. And agreed, that win, the LHC win is a huge, huge, huge win for Louisiana and for our communities. And I know that advocates have long pushed for expansion of protections, not just around criminalization, but for adding sexual orientation, gender identity to Louisiana's fair housing law protections. They are already included in Orleans Parish, and more recently HUD has issued some guidance around this. But why do you all think, and Dylan and Ms. Dion, especially interested in hearing your thoughts, why do you think this particular reform has been so difficult? And what do you think advocates can do to push for change for that inclusion in the coming year?
I have some thoughts, Ms. Dion. All right, so some of what Gabrielle was saying really resonated with me around there being, I think, more energy around housing issues right now than we've seen in a really, really long time, possibly, you know, most of our lifetimes. What is consistently true is that our elected officials are very far behind us as sort of the people who elect them. It takes a while for them to catch up to where their constituents are. And so, you know, as a result, we've really only seen in very recent years, thanks mostly to the work of the folks at Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, our elected officials, especially on the state level, pick this up as a priority. And I think y'all heard from Representative Royce DePlessis right before this panel. We have Representative Amy Freeman, who has been working on this bill that adds these protections most recently. And before her, Representative Patricia Haynes-Smith from Baton Rouge, who worked this issue for several years before leaving the legislature. That's 3 people. Rep. Pat Smith was also the person that passed the bill that preempt the nuisance ordinances that would get people kicked out of their housing, right? So really small number of folks who have set this as a priority, and that's going to take a while to grow some momentum behind it, I think. We also consistently see people who in theory are supposed to be like allies or have said that they're allies to the LGBTQ community just not show up for us. And I'll just be really frank, like this is something that is very frustrating to me as an advocate, where we have all of these folks who are in these positions of power who are really, really excited to quietly tell us how much they support us, and then they don't show up for us. And that's been the case with, you know, some of the electeds in our state with the most power, to stop just short of naming them, where we just don't see any action on these issues. And in fact, we see a lot of reticence to even talk about this stuff because it's perceived as toxic. And so without some of those folks' help to just normalize this, we continue to be perceived as radical when we have these conversations, and that has to change.
Absolutely. Ms. Dion, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just say that one of the things that I've learned in the years here at Women with a Vision is the beauty is seeing what our communities can do, right? And so I feel like one of the things I've noticed, it was easy to talk to people about, oh, your health, oh, your drug use, and using harm reduction modalities throughout our work. But the real power for me came when we started doing voter engagement work, right? When we started doing the integrated voter engagement work, we saw people like just own what's happening for them. And, you know, and we've moved away from how I think, I won't say those of us who saw people in our communities not trying to change their situation, when we know communities trying to change their situation every day. And as a person who is born and raised in New Orleans and lived in different areas even now, the beauty of seeing people tap into their own power for me has been really, really beautiful, right? Because that's where the change comes, where we're holding people accountable. It's kind of what Dylan just said, like people always show up. One of Women with a Vision's founder said to me one time that, she said, well, people like you because you're safe. And I was like, what? She said, well, you're the kind of lesbian that's safe to people. So it's easy for them to talk to you because you look like them. The way you dress, it's comfortable for people because you look, quote unquote, she was joking when she said normal, right? But the beauty of it, like throughout our Deep South decrim bill around decriminalizing sex work here in Louisiana, bringing almost 200 sex workers to testify to the Capitol was really big, right? And some people wouldn't see that as people who affect housing, but these are people who need housing and want to keep their housing. And so watching people just step into their power is the way forward for me. It's making sure that people have the information that they need and they don't have to advocate like we do. We've decided to do this way, but having people who are directly affected really tap into their networks and people in their community and their neighborhoods around what they want to see is the way to go. And I'm like Dylan, I'm all about holding people accountable, and so over people like for the moment, right? For the election time, and that you want us to show up. Well, we're going to continue to tap on your door because you need to show up for us. And it's just about holding them accountable and making sure that people have what they need. And I've just seen that as a big shift. There was a time where no one who was involved in sex work would ever think about showing their face publicly to discuss that, right? Or formerly incarcerated women or women who are domestic violence survivors really show up and talk about what their needs are and demanding that. And I want to see more of that. And I believe we're going to get more of that moving forward because they are behind. We are ahead of the game. Community and activists, we are ahead of the game because we're living it and we're seeing it every day and figuring out strategies to push. And so it is going to be about holding those people accountable and just making sure that we have what we need and that we continue to fight together. I know that sounds like, woo-woo, but it's true. It's what we're living, right? It's what makes this work possible, and knowing that it's not just you, there are other organizations where we're all saying, that, no, we're going to change this, and it's happening. So it's been really beautiful for me, for somebody who started this work at 19, I'm 53, but watching the change in my city, and not always by what politicians will do, but what we will do. And throughout the state has been really beautiful to see that growth and emergence of people power.
Whew. I don't know about y'all, but this panel has been absolutely amazing. We do have a few more minutes, so I do have one final question for our panelists, but I want to remind everyone, if you do have a question for any of our panelists, please feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll be looking on the lookout for that. But my final question to you all, and thank you all so much for your pearls of wisdom throughout this last hour or so. I know we all work for organizations that advocate for a lot of different policy changes, advocate for a lot of different things, but we're also organizations with limited resources. We've got to try and pick and choose our strategic objectives, what we can get past at this time, what makes the most sense. But I know we all also typically have a wish list, right? Like, we have those things where if we could just wave a magic wand and get rid of this one thing or get rid of this one policy, things would be a lot better for the communities that we serve. So it'd be great to hear from you all. What is your wish list item, your one thing that you're working on or thinking about right now as it relates to overcriminalization, that if you could wave a magic wand would go away and have a significant impact on the communities that you serve?
I'll go.
Great.
So I was in DC last month with Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, Congresswoman Cori Bush, and Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, and for a press conference on the Capitol steps for the introduction of the Fixed Clemency Act. The Fixed Clemency Act stands for the Fair and Independent Experts in Clemency Act. And so this is a bill that my organization, the Thurman Perry Foundation, as well as some amazing organizations around the country, got to offer input on the drafting of. And it will be, and I say will because I am putting all the good juju in the air, once it passes, will be a complete overhaul in the clemency, pardon, restoration of rights process. Currently, how clemency works is that it starts and stops in the DOJ. And when someone introduces an appeal for clemency, they want to come out of jail, literally the unilateral decision can be made in the DOJ, and that can introduce so much bias. The cops from your hometown can call up there and just be like, we ain't feeling it. So, we just gonna, we ain't, us down here, we don't like it. We feel like they need to stay. And that can be the end of it. Before it ever hits the president's desk, that can be the end of it. And so when this piece of federal policy passes, instead, there will be a 9-person panel made up of at least one formerly incarcerated person, along with mental health experts, all appointed by that sitting president. And they will be the ones to decide everyone, be it a pardon process, a restoration of rights process, and the clemency process, and they will be the ones to go through those applications and send it to the president's desk. There are 15,000 people waiting on, sitting through multiple presidents,
right,
waiting to come home. And you can literally just make a call. Some cop somewhere can make a call and just be like, you know what, I just don't want them to come home. Some prosecutor can make a call somewhere and just be like, I'm not feeling it, and it's just got to be something done. It just can't work like this. And so that's my wish list. That's my hope.
Great. Anybody else?
I'll quickly say, so this is something that that's been on my heart for like the last maybe 3 going on 4 years. One, I want people to mind their business. It is my dream that if it's not benefiting somebody else, mind your business and just let people live. Like that really is my dream. It sounds real simple, but it really is my dream. Number two is, as a person who was born and raised in New Orleans, and, you know, my family struggled like many families. We've experienced the same traumas living in the city as many other people, with having family members incarcerated, family members murdered, where you're going to live, where are we going to find safe housing. So as a Black woman who is a Black lesbian who had 2 children, and I remember moving from uptown to mid-city so that I could live in a safer neighborhood. But it really wasn't safe because my son was constantly harassed by white people and police. And so as my career progressed, you know, you think about, like, we're taught that we're supposed to move where they are because now we've made it. And I did that. And the third home that I bought in the city is actually in the Upper Ninth Ward, in the Upper Nine, in the St. Claude neighborhood. And can I tell you, I love my neighborhood? Can I just tell you, like, I would like us to make the investment in those neighborhoods that historically been us. I remember telling my wife, I don't want to live in no Ninth Ward. I didn't work hard to live in the Ninth Ward. I don't want to be there. I'm so glad that I changed my mind. I am so overjoyed that I changed my mind. So for me, I would like to see more of us. Can we just build on what other people are trying to take away? Mm-hmm. Can we build on, like, when I see people, you know, white women jogging at 7 o'clock at night in the Ninth Ward with the stroller and all this kind of stuff, yet we have been taught not to move in those neighborhoods because this exists. And I'll just say this quickly, if we really pay attention, I want more people to realize that the same things you think that exist in my neighborhood exist in yours too. And we're seeing that play out right now, right? So it's no more us and them, where we're supposed to be. We've moved on up, so we're supposed to live here. I am very happy and pleased that we live in the Upper Nine. I love walking through my neighborhood and talking about people. And all I see is, like, really the beauty of Black people who are struggling, but also who have joy. And so I would really like to see more of that, you know, more of that around, like, who we are and what has historically been ours, that we reclaim that as a thing we should be doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And last but not least, Dylan, would you like to share your wish list item before we wrap up?
Sure. For me, you know, it does go back to electoral organizing, and that's not the part of the work that I'm involved in personally, but it is the thing that would make my work possible in a lot of ways and in a lot of places. And so mine would be you know, passage of the comprehensive federal voting rights reform bill that's being held up in the Senate right now, but also youth suffrage. I want to see the voting age lowered significantly, like to 14, right? I think that, like, it's absurd to think that, like, anyone could possibly make an argument that an 8th grader is any less equipped to make an informed decision about the world that they live in than your parents. Have you talked to your parents lately and heard some of their opinions, right? So I want to see that happen. And we know that the younger young people get involved politically, the more likely they are to stay involved in it. That's something that I think would benefit us immensely across the country.
That's something that I had not, well, I've obviously thought of the issue, but something that wouldn't necessarily come to mind in this conversation. So thank you for raising that. And I think that's really important. You know, people should have a voice at whatever age, a voice in the world around them and what their legislators are doing on their behalf. You know, we want to make sure everybody is represented. Absolutely. So we do have to wrap up, but I just have to say this has been such an amazing, amazing panel. Thank you all so much for joining us, for sharing your wisdom, your work, and your energy and your community with us. It has been so fantastic talking with you. We did get one question in the chat about recommended reports or studies on the disproportionate overrepresentation of Black women in the criminal justice system. So perhaps if any of you have one or two off the top of your head, we can go ahead and put them in the chat as we move on to our keynote. But thank you again for being here. And next, I will turn it back over to our Executive Director, Kashana Hill, to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to all of our panelists. I'm so excited to move us into our keynote. We have had, I think, wonderful conversations throughout the morning that will set us up very nicely for the speaker that is next going to share some insights with you all. As we bring Professor Cashin in and get everything set up, I will just do a brief introduction and then turn things over. So again, for people who may be just joining us for our keynote address, my name is Kashana Hill, and I'm Executive Director of the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. For everyone who has been with us for the entirety of the event, we thank you. And I would like to introduce to you all Professor Sheryll Cashin. Professor Cashin is an acclaimed author who writes about the US struggle with racism and inequality. Her books have been nominated for numerous awards, including the NAACP Image Award for Nonfiction, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award for Nonfiction, and an Editor's Choice in the New York Times Book Review. Professor Cashin is the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law, Civil Rights, and Social Justice at Georgetown University, and she's an active member of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council. Professor Cashin is a former law clerk to US Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, and she also worked in the Clinton White House as an advisor on community development in inner city neighborhoods. She is a contributing editor for Politico magazine. Professor Cashin's latest book is White Space, Black Hood, Opportunity Hoarding and Segregation in the Age of Inequality. She currently resides in Washington, D.C. with her husband and twin sons, and you can follow her work at SherylCashin.com, and we will share a link to Professor Cashin's website in our chat box. Professor Cashin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Is it Kashana? Am I saying your name correctly? Thank you for that.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for that generous introduction. I have been listening in a little bit this morning. I just want to begin by saying I really appreciate what all of you do. You know, you're out there trying to make stable housing available to people. And I just so appreciate you. And that's why I'm here with you today. And I love all 104 participants. So thank you. Good morning. I'm going to share with you some key insights from my latest book. Yeah, I'm plugging a book, but I have spent, it just so happens to be that my passion is your passion, right? I've spent 2 decades of my life researching and thinking about residential segregation and why it is that we have communities of incredible abundance and advantage, and communities of concentrated need and how it's racialized. And it gets to the larger themes you guys are dealing with, the source of need, NIMBYism. And as I tell my students, I hold no punches in this book. It's really the whole system. I say we have a system of residential caste, and it's born of antipathy to Black people. Let me just go ahead and start my slides, and I'm going to try to get through them so we can have a conversation. So let's do this. Share my screen. Go to my desktop. I do this for virtual teaching. I assume there are lots of lawyers here, and this will feel like you're back in school, but in a positive way, I hope. All right, let's see. Just a second. Slideshow. Play from start. Kashana, can you see my slide? I just want to be sure.
We sure can. Everything looks great on our end. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm thrilled to be speaking on the theme of Fit for a King in this This is my book cover. I'll keep going. I'm going to start with this map of Minneapolis. And the star, the black star, is the place where George Floyd endured his slow execution. And what a lot of people don't realize about that pivotal event in American history is a story. There's a serious story of segregation there. What you're looking at on the left, one green dot is 100 Black people. This is Minneapolis, right? And on the right, one red dot represents 10 poor people, right? And so you're seeing concentrated poverty and concentrated affluence. This is the affluent white space, and this is, you know, some of George Floyd was killed in a neighborhood called Powderhorn, which is due south of some of the highest poverty neighborhoods on the lower side. And part of what I'm arguing, or part of what I show in the book, is that, you know, it would not have been possible for millions of individuals, or, you know, hundreds of thousands of individuals in this city to produce this stark concentration of poverty and affluence just through their individual prejudices. This is produced segregation, which helps explain why the Twin Cities region has one of the highest standards of living in the country and among the nation's highest rates of racial inequality at the same time on dimensions like income, wealth, employment, life expectancy, educational attainment. I heard discussion about all of these things. And in my book, I claim that we have a system of residential class in which we construct and maintain affluent white space. We overinvest and exclude in those places. And at the other end of the spectrum, we contain, segregate, and frankly, prey on people in concentrated, high poverty, Black and brown neighborhoods. And we tell stories about the people who live in the hood to justify the way things are. And I say, we have this system of residential caste. And by the way, I want to make it clear, some top of the line points, right? In the last 2 decades, residential segregation has been getting worse in this country. And the 2 most persistent types of neighborhoods are affluent, poverty-free spaces, which are overwhelmingly, they're always majority white, and concentrated poverty neighborhoods. They are the most persistent types of neighborhoods, and often they do exist right across a boundary or a highway or a river from each other. And the boundaries to these neighborhoods are hardening, meaning it's increasingly more difficult to get into affluent, high opportunity space, and it's increasingly more difficult to get out of concentrated poverty, Black, or the hood. I use that phrase for me. That is not a pejorative. Okay. No. So, and then what I argue is, let's see if I can, next slide. This is a follow-on institution of white supremacy. Each time or era in this country in which we seem to have put to bed a peculiar Black subordinating institution, we created another one. From slavery to Jim Crow to the iconic residential segregation that I just showed you on that map. And each of these institutions, there was a stereotype, an anti-Black stereotype that was propagated to defend and normatively justify the institution. All right, now I'm going to go to this. hold on, sorry, apologize. Here are some of the stereotypes and public policies that over a century constructed and maintain our current institution of residential caste. And I underscore, this is why I underscore to my law students, that there's an iterative relationship. You know, a stereotype gets propagated and weaponized in politics to justify the adoption of a public policy or law. The law, creates structures of opportunity for some and absence of it for others. And then the people who participate in those institutions or laws and benefit from them, they begin to acquire or participate, reify the stereotype. The stereotype and the institution has a way of conscripting people into participating in the institution as well. So we've been in this vicious cycle for more than a century. I'm not going to go over line by line the different types of policies. I'm pretty sure you're quite familiar with them. Richard Rothstein covers particularly the history of redlining and the cumulative brunt force trauma to Black neighborhoods. I do that in my book as well. Now, continuing on, I use in the first chapter of my book, I follow Baltimore through all of these stages, right? And I'll underscore, Baltimore in the 1890s, or actually Baltimore in the antebellum era, had one of the largest populations of free Black people in the country. Certainly in states that were slaves, where slavery reigned and was legal. In fact, those free Black people moving around was part of what inspired Frederick Douglass when he was working there. I think it was on the docks to escape, to be free. Well, in the 1890s, you could, even at the turn of the century, if you were Black in Baltimore, you could go to the stores, try on the clothes. You could, if you could afford it, you could buy a house wherever you wanted to. It's only with the Great Migration, the onset of the Great Migration in the teens, 1910s and 19-teens, tens, okay. When the beginning of the Great Migration, over 7 decades, more than 6 million people move north and west to escape violence-backed Jim Crow and seek opportunity. And the primary response to the great migrants, wherever they landed in large numbers, was to use restrictive covenants and straight up violence. And they tried racial zoning, that got struck down in Buchanan versus Worley, but to contain them in their own neighborhoods. And then through redlining, cut those neighborhoods off from the kind of credit and subsidies for mortgages and public investment that was rained down on majority white areas. So by the 40s, you get this stark neighborhoods, Baltimore colloquially, the areas of East and West Baltimore, heavily Black, and referred to as the Black Butterfly. And those very neighborhoods, as you can see, looking at the HOLC redlining maps, wherever Black people, again, landed, in the 200 cities where HOLC had them geographically mapped, they were marked in red, explicitly deemed hazardous, and immediately you start to see disinvestment and decline in these neighborhoods, many of which were quite vital. There's a neighborhood in Baltimore called Harlem Park, and that was where, you know, leading jazz singers, Billie Holiday and others would sing and perform. And there's a Fed study from, I think it's 2018, a very recent Fed study, which found that 8 decades on, you could go back to the neighborhoods that were marked with a D, and it correlates to this day with disinvestment, decline, and racial segregation. Then, you know, the federal government piles on. This is a map of the same areas. The purple areas are the redlined areas with urban renewal, major urban renewal developments. The numbers here are the numbers of how 1,600 homes are the number of homes that were mowed down. You get displacement. And then on top of the displacement, the disruptions of urban renewal projects, which Baldwin, my hero, James Baldwin, famously called, infamously, I guess, famously, called Negro removal. The city and HUD pile on by their decisions about where to put the people who are displaced. Many of the Black families that were displaced by urban renewal projects and highway projects that mowed through Black areas were put into public housing intentionally built on a separate and unequal basis. And what happens when you have a new public housing, particularly a dense public housing development where 100% of the people have to be poor, and it's assigned on a racial basis where you overnight, you are creating a ghetto, extremely dense, concentrated poverty, which had not existed. Again, at the turn of the century, Black people actually were scattered around the city. They weren't concentrated. And the social distinctions that come naturally to people become much more efficient when you overlay it with race, right? When you can point to extremely concentrated poverty neighborhoods, basically right across a boundary. This is a color-coded map. Blue is, one dot is one person, blue is white, green is Black, red is Asian, this orange is Hispanic, and there's, you know, it's hard to discern, but the few Native Americans and other race people. But when you have, you can point to neighborhoods that have been historically defunded, historically disinvested, they look shabby, there's concentrated poverty. Surprise, surprise, you get, you know, habits of avoidance, right? And that's the NIMBYism that people who are trying to build affordable housing or get people access to affordable housing have to deal with every day. You know, the attitude of places like here is hell no, hell no. And there are deep anti-Black, nasty stereotypes animating perceptions of subsidized housing, low-income housing, people coming from low-income areas because of this long history. Okay, so I argue in my book that we have today, I've gone over the past, but my argument is we have a system in which public policies still double down and encourage, we tend to encourage through public policy the maintenance of boundaries. We have 3 predominant anti-Black processes that explain the continuation of these stark patterns of segregation: boundary maintenance, opportunity hoarding, and stereotype-driven surveillance. Everybody here who's listening to me is intimately familiar with the policies that maintain boundaries. And I put exclusionary zoning at the top of the list. There was a very revealing New York Times article in the last year, which showed that in many cities in this country, a lot of them happen to be ones where great migrants landed. It's illegal to build anything other than a detached single family home on as much as 75% of the land. The major public policy decisions that have shaped residential space in this country from the teens forward have been designed to, I guess, accommodate to or shape the desires mainly of white homeowners, particularly affluent white homeowners, okay? And then there's opportunity hoarding. And this is a point that I think is less understood than boundary maintenance in American society. What is opportunity hoarding? It's just like what I said. It's over-investing in neighborhoods of advantage, excluding, and disinvesting elsewhere. And, you know, if you look at, I'm going to be showing you maps shortly in other places, but all of you are familiar with this. You know where the advantaged neighborhoods are in the communities you live in. What's really important to understand is that all of the people who are excluded from high poverty space, which is the majority of people in most metropolitan areas, are subsidizing the golden infrastructure you often find in those neighborhoods, subsidizing them with their tax dollars, their income tax dollars, sales tax, gas tax, you name it. And I mean, I can get into explicit examples, but here's an example. Even in Black-run cities like Baltimore, and I say Black-run because Baltimore, it's a majority Black city, and it has majority Black representation on the city council, and it has had something like 7 of the last 8 mayors have been Black. Even with that kind of representation, they did a study and found, to their own horror, that when they looked at their community development funding and their investments in infrastructure, et cetera, that they were spending 4 times as much in majority white areas as in Black neighborhoods. And this is the same in Chicago. You know, in Chicago, a recent study found that white neighborhoods in Chicago receive 3 times as much public and private investment as Black ones. That is opportunity hoarding. And then stereotype-driven surveillance is familiar to anyone who's just been paying attention and watching. We have a distinctly different kind of policing. I'll allude back to the map of Minneapolis, right? A distinctly different type of policing in high poverty Black and brown neighborhoods, a kind of policing that would not be tolerated in affluent white space. One where police come in those neighborhoods with a lens of presuming every young man is a thug, every young man is a potential criminal, stopping and arresting a lot of people. Particularly, and I cite a study in my book about arrests for nonviolent offenses in Washington, D.C. Surprise, surprise, you know, Black people are way, way disproportionately arrested for things that white people would receive a pass on, like, you know, drinking with an open container, stuff like that. But then we have exploding surveillance of Black bodies, and it happens particularly in gentrifying areas, but not by the police, just by, you know, a lot of citizens, right? And the worst example of it is the kind of vigilantism that killed poor Ahmaud Arbery just for jogging in a white neighborhood. Okay, well, here's more evidence of what I'm talking about, the concentration of affluence and of poverty. These maps are from Paul Dragowski, who's a demographer and the person who invented, I suppose, the technical definition of a high poverty distressed neighborhood or a ghetto is a neighborhood where 40% or more of the people who live there are poor. And you'll see with this color-coded map, the highly red, highly crimson places are very, very poor. And look what happened in Pittsburgh over about a 15-year period. Certain areas which had some socioeconomic diversity have been scrubbed completely clean and have become, well, I wouldn't say, I mean, it's not the same as in these areas, right? But you see the footprint of concentrated poverty has been shifting. And here, you know, this is, by the way, August Wilson, the playwright's Hill District right here. But, you know, this is in an era when the city was, in theory, revitalizing. There's something like 60 robotics companies. They had a tech revolution going on in the city. And I cite evidence that as cities were becoming more popular again and suburbanites were moving back to the city and cities were revitalizing, in theory, actually many Black neighborhoods, particularly ones that had been marked with a D, all of them had been marked with a D, actually declined and were worse off in that period. And again, what happens when you get these stark differences? Here is a low poverty area. Now there's a big cliff here, if you're familiar with it, but here's a low poverty area. And then you have this concentrated area. Attitudes, people get crazy attitudes about Blackness and Black people, in part because of situations like this. And if you're living over here, well, I switched, but anyway, but you know, here's Philadelphia, you know, Center City. I have a great grandmother, an ancestor. Center City used to be very Black, but you know, Center City has been scrubbed out, the most, you know, affluent white space. And look at the footprint of concentrated poverty. It's exploding and growing fastest in the suburbs. I'm just showing you some of these maps. Some of you may be familiar with this, but it's very common for a interstate to become the boundary dividing affluent white and concentrated poverty space. This is a map of Houston. What you're seeing here, this pale area is majority white. A star is a Houston Public Housing Authority project. Never in the history of building public housing in Houston had they ever built a housing project in a majority white area. And they actually had proposed to do it to atone for their sins of concentrating poverty. I have a different map. I wish I had used it. That had little green dots that showed low-income housing, tax credit sponsored properties, same pattern, right? Almost none in this majority area, but they proposed to atone for their sins by building a mixed income public housing sponsored development that looked beautiful near the Galleria and affluent white space, and people there obviously engaged in incredible NIMBYism, got to the Black mayor, and the project was scuttled. And this is after, you know, and around the same time, the city of Houston settled a Fair Housing Act lawsuit brought against it by the Obama administration's HUD, and they conceded that 71% of government subsidized housing projects in Houston had been built in only 5 of its 88 neighborhoods, right? So government, particularly in the low-income housing tax credit, right, we're spending money to concentrate poverty still. Okay, this is just a quick map of Chicago showing that, you know, middle-class people have left the city, and basically you have a tale of two cities. This is very high income, you know, Magnificent Mile, and this is the rest of Chicago, very low income, right? And Chicago, the state of Illinois, I have this stat in the book, spends $1 million every 4 years on every inner city block, on 851 inner city poor blocks in that city to incarcerate people. Every 4 years, the state of Illinois and the city is spending almost $1 billion to incarcerate people. And at the same time, they have gone through waves of school closures, closing schools here and opening new ones here, right? Enormous, gorgeous public art spaces and things like that. And again, I said, in Chicago, majority white neighborhoods have been getting about 3 times as much investment. The new mayor is trying to disrupt that. She has this new $1 billion initiative to put money into the South Side. But this is what residential cast looks like. Okay, so let me leave you with some hope. The beauty, once you understand these systemic processes of residential caste, the beauty is the way forward is clear. You just need to do the opposite. So I'll go back to this slide. Inclusion rather than exclusion. Mandatory inclusionary zoning rather than exclusion. Greenlining of historically defunded neighborhoods and racial equity in budgeting rather than the opportunity hoarding I've described. And when it comes to surveillance, changing the nature of the relationship of the city with high poverty neighborhoods from punitive to caring. And I give examples of, in fact, if you're interested, I just wrote a piece for Politico, came out on MLK Day, where I held up examples of cities and places where they seem to be trying to innovate on racial inequality and racial justice. I show you this. This is, you know, we had this moment, summer 2020, 2,500 places across this country, more than 20 million people holding up signs, claiming that Black Lives Mattered. And I'll stop the share now to conclude. The thing that I say in this MLK piece, and the thing that I'll leave you with, in championing the creation of the beloved community, Dr. King, you know, it wasn't a utopian abstraction for him. It was radical, but it was a realistic vision for building communities in which racial integration and reconciliation could be achieved through a critical mass of committed citizens working together, right? And getting there required, you know, gathering information about existing systems, educating people about them, and then going through direct action to demand different policies. And I offer examples. I'll just end with Minneapolis. Minneapolis, much in the news, right? Through a multi-year education process where civic-minded people, and I believe some professors, gave presentations like the one I'm giving, with showing the history of how segregation was constructed and educated people about it. They changed the politics around zoning and were able to create an overwhelming majority to rescind its single-family zoning ordinance. It passed 12-1. The one dissenter was the representative of the affluent white space I pointed out on the map. And now every neighborhood in Minneapolis has to at least have be open to duplexes or triplexes. And they zoned, particularly near transit, for a lot more dense multifamily housing and mandated that 10% of those units be moderate income. That's moderate. I mean, it should have been like 20%. It should have included very low income. But the point is, they've gotten started on a radically different vision than what they had before. I'll stop there and take questions.
Thank you, Professor Cashin. You have really tied together so many elements of the conversations that we've been having today throughout our panels. We actually had a panelist on from who used to be with Texas Housers and is very familiar with the Fountain View example. And we discussed that in our first panel, which was on NIMBY sentiment and the ways in which NIMBYism, right, perpetuates segregation in communities across the country. We've also had a conversation about how the overcriminalization of certain people who are marginalized within our societies really creates barriers, right, to fair housing choice for them. And so there are so many threads that your presentation has brought together for us today. And just following through a little bit on some of that, I'm wondering if you know of any examples or can share any success stories where some of these solutions that you mentioned are actually working, right? So communities where mandatory inclusionary zoning is making a difference, communities where, for instance, local elected officials are implementing neighborhood engagement processes that are more representative and equitable. And I'll just say a little bit around that piece specifically. Here in New Orleans, the Fair Housing Action Center recently released a report showing that the outsized voice that is given to white-led neighborhood associations is really perpetuating segregation across our city. That kind of deep NIMBYism has led to the killing of over 600 affordable homes in New Orleans since Hurricane Katrina hit. And you shared examples from Baltimore and Chicago, right, about how even when cities have majority or very large populations of Black folks, we have elected officials and policymakers who are still listening to the voices of people who have historically had power in this country, right? And so if you have any examples or can discuss where folks might be doing things a little differently, I think that would be so helpful to hear for us as we're all trying to grapple with next steps and how to move forward.
Okay, so I'm just going to highlight some of the examples I just gave in the piece I wrote for Politico. Pardon me, I'm a little mentally tired, so I'm pulling up my
No problem. I think we all understand that. And as you keep
just a second, I have my talking points.
Problem.
Here it is. Okay, hold on. Got it. Just a second. Okay, so I'm gonna, so around the zoning, this one won't, I mean, I gave you the example of Minneapolis, right? And I just wanted to underscore that it took a couple of years of a group of people going around and educating key people about the history to change the political context, right? One thing I've noticed, like if you, wherever you are, you can Google redlining New Orleans or redlining, wherever you are. I could see that there's quite a bit of consciousness that has, I'll be honest, my friend Richard Rothstein has helped raise this awareness, but there are on the ground places that are using, like Louisville, for example, has a website. The government has a website where they put their whole history on the website and it's been, it really seemed to have educated the mayor and been a source of ongoing conversation about how they need to put more money into the West End, right? Baltimore Minneapolis, and Seattle have all formally adopted a racial equity law that requires neighborhood analysis about where the money is going to disrupt that systemic practice of overinvesting or disinvesting in Black neighborhoods. I was just on the phone a couple weeks ago with a guy who's head of the office that negotiates the Mount Laurel obligations in New Jersey. I mean, New Jersey's lucky because they have this famous Supreme Court case, which requires under the state constitution for every township in New Jersey to have its fair share of affordable housing. So because of that constitutional obligation, the office, the state office that administers that obligation, and the point is something like 300 towns have formally adopted mandatory inclusionary zoning ordinances, right? Now that's small solace to you who are working in New Orleans, where you don't have a state mandate coming down. But my point is it can be done, but you have to build coalitions. And what Building One New Jersey has done, they actually come in and teach people how to do coalition building. The key is to get to majority power with the decision maker by building coalitions between majority minority neighborhoods, Black and brown, and the struggling white neighborhoods that also have more than their fair share of affordable housing. Once people understand the ways in which they're basically being put upon, I mean, you know, in terms of more than their fair share of affordable housing and less than their fair share of equitable investment, the kind of investment that makes neighborhoods nice, there's a potential point of coalition building that can build majority power on the zoning board, on the city council, right? It doesn't just have to be Black neighborhoods going it alone, you know? And this is kind of what King's message was about. Like, you don't have to necessarily convince the super wealthy neighborhoods. What you do have to do is get enough power among the people outside of it to say, this is how it's going to be. We're forcing this on you now. You know, we are disrupting the systems that have over-advantaged you now. And you got to live with the program. That's what democracy is, right? And I actually think that cities have a better opportunity, particularly progressive ones, have more of an opportunity for majority power to actually decide the policies, because there's less, we know at the national level, there are structures designed to stop majority will, right? And yes, some cities that are in red states sometimes, the state legislature interferes and doesn't let you do what you want to do. But and often I find, particularly with housing, the places that do best are places where there's a faith-based community that's really central to building the moral case. I do think there are people of goodwill. I don't want to be Pollyannish about it, but if you've got faith leaders in there, trying to get people to walk the walk and say, this society we've constructed is an immoral society. That's why I wrote the book, Anyway, I hope this is helpful. I could give other examples. I mean, there's 60 mayors now. You can see there's mayors for a guaranteed income. There's 60 mayors who said we support having a guaranteed income pilot, a universal basic income pilot. There are cities that have made their bus routes to the poorest neighborhoods free. right? There are cities that, if you look at the office of the website Advance Peace, there's something like 20 cities that have opened these Office of Neighborhood Safety, an alternative to mass policing and mass incarceration, that are really helping reduce gun violence by working with the relatively small number of young men in neighborhoods plagued by gun violence to change their lives, right? So I hold up these examples of things that we have the power to do right now.
Thank you, and you've shared so much of your brilliance with us today that I don't want to tax you anymore. So I just want to say thank you. And what I very much appreciate about what you shared with us today and what you just shared in response to the question is that you're really helping us see beyond, right, the idea of trying to convince people who are the beneficiaries of this white opportunity hoarding, right? We can have a strategy beyond trying to win their hearts and minds, which there are certainly people doing that work and they can keep doing it. But you've reminded us really of the power that we can hold and the ways in which we can see the change that we want on trying to get the people who benefit from the power structure to agree with us. And I think that's so helpful.
I bring my hero out. Power concedes nothing without a demand. Go build some power and demand it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Professor Cashin, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing your insight with us. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you so much. And as we wrap up today's event, I would like to just thank all of the speakers who joined us today. Thank you so much to the friends and partners of the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center who have joined us. I see many former LaFHAC staff members in the attendee list, and so we thank you to people who have shaped this organization in ways large and small. Thank you to the board members. I do want to give a special shout out to my team, the staff members at the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. Every day, I'm so honored to work with such dedicated and talent advocates. The work that you do does change lives, as we've seen today, and I'm so thankful to get to work with such a wonderful team. For those who are joining us today, I do want to ask that you please fill out your evaluation and survey via the link in the chat. We'll be sharing that in the chat, and you should be able to do that immediately upon leaving the webinar. The survey will pop up for you. I do want to ask one final time that you consider becoming a recurring donor to LaFHAC in any amount to sustain our work and allow us to respond quickly in this very unpredictable climate. We've also shared a link in the chat there for you to do that. If you missed any of today's summit, we'll be sharing the recordings at fitforaking.org. Thank you all for joining us today.